Here on Gilligan's Isle, by Russell Johnson with Steve Cox. An unnecessary introduction. Gilligan. Hi, Professor. What are you doing? Professor. I'm making notes for a book. It's to be a chronicle of our adventures on the island. I think it's a book people will buy, don't you? Gilligan. Sure, I'll buy one. I'm dying to find out what happens to us. That's from episode number 2, Home Sweet Hut. It's time for this book. In the mid-1960s, I was stuck somewhere in the South Pacific with 6 others, swimming through network ratings and problems and friendships and family. Nearly 30 years have passed since the 7 of us signed those unfortunate contracts and landed on Gilligan's Island. That series has affected my life every day since. In fact, today I live with my wife on an island. Old habits die hard. At this point, it's doubtful there's much I could say that would sour the appeal of Gilligan's Island, even though there have been many times I've refused to reveal aspects of my relationships with these fellow castaways, these friends of mine. So you may find a few surprises. It's a tough, strong, funny little show, this Gilligan's Island, and it just won't go away. And now we have a president who watched Gilligan's Island growing up, right along with the rest of the baby boomers. Especially to those who watched the show when they were children and grew up with us in reruns, I am the professor, just as Bob Denver is Gilligan. This is the power of television. Every day I encounter fans who approach me, sometimes nervously, sometimes so casually you would think we were on the island together. Hey, aren't you the... And there are some who have seen the episode so many times they can tell you which one is which from the opening shot. Oh, this is the one where Gilligan sees everything upside down. And I must say, it's flattering when science fiction buffs remember some of the 50s flicks I did when 3D was starting to get warm, like it came from outer space. At least sometimes somebody recalls me in something other than Gilligan's. I guess I'm finally resigned to the professor being my most famous role. Funny how those things work out. Still, the fallout from this island haunts me, although it stopped plaguing me to the point of misery a while back. Since Gilligan's Island, my life has hit highs and lows. A few years after my first wife, Kay, passed away, I married Constance Dane. Connie was an actress in many television shows, among them the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, Father Knows Best, Matinee Theater, and Tallahassee 7000. Connie is beautiful, spiritual, and she's my manager. Her advice is invaluable, especially regarding this book, and I love her dearly. So here's the professor and his wife living on an inhabited island in Puget Sound in a beautiful home surrounded by wooded heaven where deer come right up to our patio door. Above the mantel is a gift from Sherwood Schwartz, a masterfully matted and framed portrait in glorious color of the 7 stranded castaways hanging directly over the fireplace. Believe it or not, until recently, the idea of being on an island never held much appeal for me. As a bombardier in World War II, I was shot down over one. And in the 1960s, my career got stranded on one. Gilligan's Island has been a mixed blessing in every sense of the cliché. Sure, it gave me fame and recognition long after it should have died a natural death. But I'll warn you, there was a time when I was not at all proud of being one of a 7-man totem pole, one of the rest, on a show that was universally proclaimed by the critics to be crap. Twice I turned down invitations to test for the series. Finally, when I gave in, I took on the role of the professor simply for the compensation. All I knew was that it was a job that helped me support my family. What I told TV Guide back in the 60s still applies. It's cold out, boy. It's rough. If you're an actor, you should work as an actor. In the beginning, both Tina Louise and I stood under the same dark cloud of apprehension about doing this show, maybe more so than the others. Come to think of it, Natalie Schaefer, Mrs. Howell, was noticeably disappointed that the show was actually purchased and set to start. Natalie had lived in New York for a long time, and she was not comfortable there. She accepted the role for the pilot just to cash in on a free trip to Hawaii. She thought the script was dreadful. It never entered her mind that anyone would actually like the show. As for me, I felt mighty overqualified, and it really disturbed me. For years I was trained in the theater, and I was always serious about what I did as an actor. Tina was a bit more forceful when she blurted publicly that she was ashamed of the show, while we were still filming new episodes each week. Still, every one of us always pulled it off for the camera. In the final analysis, that's all that matters. We took the job seriously, and regardless of any problems with each other or difficulties at home, we worked closely together and made the best of it. I'm convinced that our creator, Sherwood Schwartz, couldn't have hired better people. I'm not afraid to brag a bit. My work is good. I'm a damn good actor. And that's equally true of the 6 others in the cast. In just 3 seasons on CBS, we created almost 100 episodes. That's equivalent to the output of 5 seasons now. I was always happy to be working with such competent, talented actors, but silently my displeasure rose after we were canceled, and the show plagued me. I didn't realize it at first, but because of Gilligan's, I was going to have a difficult time reestablishing a career. Then a funny thing happened. Over the years, I began noticing something unusual about Gilligan's Island. I looked at what television kept producing, and you know what? I realized we really weren't so bad after all. The show's uniqueness became apparent. I never imagined the show would maintain such a warm appeal 10, 20, or even 30 years later. Everyone keeps telling me that Gilligan's is a cult hit show, whatever that means. I suspect it indicates longevity, a strong appeal, and a loyalty toward a show that was instilled in many viewers' lives during their childhoods. It's true that people develop strange and lasting feelings for whatever TV shows they devoured when they were growing up. Here, 3 decades later, I still get recognized by fans who love the show and know these characters and episodes. For a few of us, our characters weren't far from our real personalities. I can say the professor was and is a part of me. But I also left him at the studio when I came home at night. Alan Hale, on the other hand, kept a sort of camaraderie with his alter ego. He loved the character, and Alan really became the skipper and rarely left his house without that cap. Natalie Schaefer, she was the very same as Mrs. Howell, only kinder. But I don't think Tina Louise ever really embraced Ginger Grant. None of us thought the show would last. Some of us thought it wouldn't last a full season. I certainly never thought we were doing work that would someday, years down the line, be dissected by fans. None of us had that idea, except maybe Sherwood Schwartz, and I think he's the only one still collecting paychecks from the show. We had no idea we would become so much a part of the public's consciousness. So why save mementos? Why sock away the scripts? And so there are a handful of Gilligan's Island's episodes that I catch today, and I sit there astounded. I have absolutely no recollection of ever performing in some of them. The memory of them is gone. Wiped. Here's where a young guy by the name of Steve Cox comes in. Steve and I met in 1986 while I was doing a play in Kansas City, Missouri. He invited me to what he described would be a tribute to Gilligan's Island at his college. So I went. No pay, it was just for the hell of it. I thought this is either going to be really nice or really awful, and it turned out really nice. I signed autographs for some very beautiful co-eds, ate a terrific Chinese lunch with Steve and his friends, and then greeted a theater full of students and faculty who waited to meet this gray-haired actor. I got a kick out of the posters around Parkville's Park College. Under my face it read, "See a real professor speak." It was an impromptu kind of thing, and they showed an episode of Gilligan's on the big screen. The school's department head even appointed me honorary professor of communication arts. That afternoon did my heart good. After that, Steve put his journalism degree to use by researching a book of his own about Gilligan's, and with tenacity, he met with all 7 of us, including Tina Louise, which was no easy task. She rarely makes herself accessible when it comes to the dreaded island. Steve and I kept in touch, and he even visited the set of Alf when 4 of us castaways put on our island costumes and appeared in a dream sequence with the furry alien rodent. Eventually, his book was, well, marooned, so recently we decided to combine notes and provide you with the complete history of the longest 3-hour tour in the history of television. So I'm not going to formally introduce each of the actors because you're just going to call us the Professor or Mary Ann anyway. And that's all right, as long as you understand that this book is how I perceived Gilligan's Island. This story is from my hut, looking out. I'm an actor, and although this may not be the scholarly dissertation you were expecting from the island egghead, I do try to take a logical and practical stance, as the professor would. This book will tell you how Gilligan's Island hit the charts and how it nearly capsized careers. So, just sit right back. Another island. When I flew as an Army Air Corps bombardier navigator in World War II, I was shot down in the Philippines over a town called Zamboanga on the island of Mindanao. In fact, there's an old song that goes way back called "The Monkeys Have No Tails in Zamboanga." I don't know who wrote it or where it came from, or who may have recorded it, but it exists. I joined the Army on my 18th birthday because it was the patriotic thing to do. I'm not trying to feed you a story of nobility or nationalism. It's just that the United States was noticeably more unified then. When I graduated from high school, I couldn't wait to get into the thick of combat. And since I had military training in school, I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to become an officer, and I set out to do that. It was the 4th of March, 1945, about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was on my 44th mission firing a .50 caliber machine gun from one of 3 B-25s that would be shot down that day. We were flying at minimum altitude, or on the deck, which means about 50 feet above the water. We were skip bombing and strafing. The pilot was firing 14 forward-fire .50 caliber machine guns by pressing just one button on his controls. With another button, he dropped 4 500-pound bombs, which skipped across the water like flat rocks across a lake. This is how we were shot down. The Japanese hit us with 20 and 40-millimeter guns that set both of our plane's engines on fire. We knew we were going to have to ditch the plane in the water, so we went into automatic and quickly began the routine we had to go through in order to do so. The first order was to get rid of everything loose, and then sit and brace yourself with your back to the front of the airplane. The plane would hit twice. If you have any control at all, you keep your nose up and your tail hits first. Then the nose comes down, and it's the second hit that's deadly. It's like hitting a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. If you haven't disposed of the machine guns or anything else loose, they can smash into you with enough velocity to kill you instantly. We took a direct hit while the engines were on fire. We were in the rear of the airplane in the radio compartment. The shell sprayed shrapnel into me and broke my ankles. It killed the radio operator next to me. He was only on his 8th mission. Our crew was picked up by the Army Air Sea Rescue Service, which flew flying boats called PBYs. The Army had some jet black PBYs assigned to them, and we called them Black Cats. They circled on a set of map coordinates generally 100 miles away from where the airstrike was taking place. We were in a strait of water just a couple of miles wide between Zamboanga and an island called Basilan, and we could see the Japanese were coming out after us in boats. Each of our life rafts held 6 guys. With life-saving efficiency, some of our group of 48 airplanes saw the Japanese, formed a line, and strafed, sinking the Japanese boats before they could get to us. We had radioed Mayday. After an hour in the water, we could see the Black Cat, which landed nearby to take us aboard, and we began to taxi on the water, attempting to take off, but the Black Cat was too heavy. The crew had to throw equipment overboard, and then we made it off the water and back to our base in the Halmahera Islands, which had a small station hospital. The medic stop was a transfer point for any seriously injured soldiers. They shipped me to a New Guinea General Hospital where I occupied a bed in the officers' ward. It was a tent structure like the one on MASH, only our floors were coral, which was tough on your feet, and there were guys lying on cots who had really been shot up. I earned my Purple Heart from that mission. I remember I was lying down when I was awarded the medal. 2 men came up to my bed, one carrying a stack of black boxes. The officer read the routine orders with no emotion at all. For wounds received in action, 2nd Lieutenant Russell Johnson, 0765497, is hereby awarded the Purple Heart by order of Colonel Smith, or some colonel. When the officer finished his speech, the sergeant with him put a little spin on the box as he tossed it at me. It slid across my chest and stopped at my throat. It was an interesting way to be awarded the Purple Heart. Later, I was also awarded the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Asiatic Pacific Theater of War ribbon with 4 battle stars, and the Philippine Liberation Medal. I'm proud of my career in the military. I was in the service for 3 years and 10 days and was honorably discharged with the rank of 1st Lieutenant on November 22, 1945. Immediately thereafter, the GI Bill allowed me to enroll in the Actors Lab in Hollywood, and my career as an actor began. The Actors Laboratory. Just after World War II, I started attending classes at the Actors Lab in Hollywood on January 2, 1946. Acting was what I had wanted to do since high school. I knew I was good at it, so through the GI Bill, I was in the first class of GIs to attend this prestigious theater school, which stemmed from the Old Group Theater in New York. The Group Theater was a powerful entity on the East Coast, well respected in the theater world, and out of it came the Actors Lab in Hollywood. In a 2-year program, we were taught the Stanislavski method by talented actor teachers among whom were Morris Karnofsky, Sam Levine, Hume Cronin, Jessica Tandy, Anthony Quinn, and Mary Tarsai. Konstantin Stanislavski taught acting in the 1920s, introducing a realistic approach. Without getting too technical in my explanation, it provided you as an actor with a way to investigate, work out, and perform a character in a play night after night from the inside out, not the outside in. The Actors Lab became my university. I attended classes from 9 a.m. till noon and from 1 till 4 p.m. At night we attended plays, films, critiques, lectures, and sometimes additional courses. Eventually, for me, it became a 24-hour labor of love. I not only studied acting, but learned fencing, body movement, voice and speech, dancing, history of the theater, set construction, and other aspects of the theater. The Actors Lab rapidly became known in Hollywood as the place to learn the craft. Everybody in the business came to see our plays, and it ended up being a terrific entree into casting offices and a way to make contacts with producers of both plays and motion pictures. Marilyn Monroe studied there. She had been sent by 20th Century Fox to hone her skills long before she became known in films, years before The Asphalt Jungle. Although it wasn't until about 4 years later that I made my film debut, in the ensuing years I worked at the BB Pen Company constructing ballpoint pens, I drove a cab, and I prepared cars for a dealership showroom. I married a beautiful actress and writer named Kay Levy, who went by the professional name of Kay Cousins. And then my break came when actor-producer Paul Henreid helped me get started by putting me in a film called For Men Only. Paul played Ingrid Bergman's husband in Casablanca. For Men Only was a film about hazing and fraternities, and I played a heavy, the villain. I love playing heavies, and this was the first of many such roles for me until Gilligan's Island, of course. I have to credit Paul Henreid, a generous man who is now gone, for my start in films. Somebody from Universal Studios saw the picture, and eventually several of us in the film were signed to contracts as studio players. Outside of some westerns I made at Universal, I ended up doing some science fiction flicks in which I played scientists, precursors to The Professor, I guess. They turned out to be cult movies, like It Came from Outer Space, one of the first films made in 3D. That film took a lot of energy because we shot it twice, once with the 3D camera, which was manufactured right there at Universal, and again with a regular 2D camera technique. The same year, I made the science fiction film This Island Earth, where I played a regular guy, a scientist named Steve Carlson, who gave his life to save the others. Jack Arnold, who later ended up directing most of the Gilligan's episodes, directed the film. He also directed Space Children, a film I did at Paramount, of which I have absolutely no recollection. I know it's on my resume, and fans quiz me about it, but for some reason, I have amnesia about that one, which might be best. A lot of sci-fi fans ask me about another classic, Attack of the Crab Monsters, which is so bad, it's good. Crab Monsters was a 1957 drive-in favorite directed by Roger Corman, who made a reputation in Hollywood for producing films quickly and with very little money. Corman was a no-nonsense guy. There was no sitting down and discussing what was really going on in a scene between the characters. No time for that. The only direction he gave us was, you gotta get out of the way of those crabs because they're gonna kill you. And that was it. I remember at Crab Monsters, I broke my toe in a scene in which I had to come up out of the ocean wearing scuba gear, along with a girl in the picture. We were supposed to shoot the scene in the morning, when the tide was out, but Roger waited until the afternoon when the tide was smashing up against large rocks, and we were both trying to remain standing and play the scene while stumbling around. And somehow I ran my little toe into a rock and broke it, and Corman had some guy on the set, not a first aid technician, mind you, tape up my toe quickly with gaffer's tape and said, "All right, back into the water, let's do it again." It's absolutely amazing to me that the sci-fi films I made eons ago have become popular over the years. I thought they would die the minute they came out, but Crab Monsters ended up making millions of dollars. I have to admit, Roger Corman did some amazing things with what little he had. Roger was an important man in film history. He gave many young actors like Jack Nicholson their break. He was a directorial tutor to such greats as Peter Bogdanovich, Joe Dante, Martin Scorsese, and Ron Howard. I'll tell you what I'm really proud of during those years. I did 2 terrific episodes of The Twilight Zone. It was considered a prestige show, and working with Rod Serling was wonderful. He was kind of a quiet, charming, self-contained guy who came from upstate New York near where I grew up, so we had something in common to talk about. I appeared as a guest star in quite a few of those vintage TV anthologies during the exciting time of live television, like Playhouse 90, Studio One, and Climax. Those shows were wonderful. Later on, I had roles on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Death Valley Days, Ben Casey, Gunsmoke, and Route 66, among many others. I only regret not being able to appear on any Star Trek episodes. That was disappointing because I'm a Trekkie. I also enjoyed the Outer Limits episode I appeared in, and Boris Karloff's Thriller, which co-starred Bill Shatner. I acted in a sprinkling of film and television westerns before I landed the role of Marshall Gibbs Scott on the TV series Black Saddle with Peter Breck. While under contract to Universal, I did a number of westerns with Audie Murphy, and one in particular that comes to mind starred Ronald Reagan, called Law and Order. I didn't have any choice in the matter because I was under contract to Universal at the time, and what I objected to was Reagan's politics. He may be a charming man otherwise, but there were political views that we violently disagreed on, and when he became president of the Screen Actors Guild, I disagreed with many of his decisions. We made Law and Order in 1952. It was released in 1953 during the McCarthy era, while the Red Scare was fully inflamed around Hollywood, and I was one of those people being hounded. I was not a communist, but because I had attended the Actors Lab, which was labeled a communist front organization, I was accused of being a communist sympathizer, a fellow traveler. And back then, Reagan saw red every time he turned around, and he made note of it when I worked with him in this Western. He was suspicious of everyone, unless you were a John Wayne-like ultra 110% American conservative. You have to realize that this was a dangerous time in this country. People's freedoms were being inhibited and challenged, and in those years you were guilty by association or accusation unless you proved yourself innocent, and Reagan was part of that. Getting marooned. I suffered incredible agonies for months. Nearly everything went wrong. Sherwood Schwartz. Sherwood Schwartz isn't exactly sure where the inspiration for Gilligan's Island came from. He read Robinson Crusoe when he was young, and he recalls a class in college that posed the question, what one thing would you wish for if you were deserted on an island? Maybe there's a little bit of William Golding's Lord of the Flies in there, too. In the spring of 1963, Sherwood Schwartz, a former writer for Red Skelton and Bob Hope, created 7 characters and typed them up as a Bible for a show he was about to launch. He plucked the name for the show's title right out of the Los Angeles White Pages, figuring Gilligan would ensure the correct attitude because it's a happy name that was also funny. And most important, he wanted to portray cliché characters who could be easily identified as social surrogates. Sherwood explains, our cast of characters were not lukewarm. They were hot. They were easily identifiable. Our bumbling hero was the most bumbling you ever saw. Our rich man was a billionaire, and the professor knew absolutely everything. Someone once said that the inhabitants of Gilligan's Island represented a variation of the 7 deadly sins. Actually, they were broad caricatures of characters we've seen on countless disaster movies. Sherwood intentionally organized this diverse group of exaggerated crazies to mirror the American melting pot, all cooking under the pressure of being completely isolated from civilization. A social microcosm, Sherwood called it, when he sat in front of network executives who had blank stares on their faces. When Sherwood put his master's degree in psychology to work and explained his elaborate basis to the folks at CBS, no one realized the show he was pitching would become the most rerun show of all time. A show about a 3-hour tour that would last 3 seasons and then be sentenced to a life of eternal syndication. Keep in mind that the notion of syndication, or reruns, was so fresh at the time that many shows were just shelved after they left the air, never to be seen again until the 1990s, when a programming-starved medium called cable would play them out of desperation, and they make money. I don't think the innocuous world of Gilligan's Island requires scholarly extrapolation. But it is astounding that Gilligan's Island has been the topic of many dissertations that attempt to reveal hidden meanings which eagerly address social issues and philosophical themes. Sherwood Schwartz's agony started when he got the go-ahead to make a pilot, even though Jim Aubrey, the president of CBS, detested the idea from the start. There were other executives in the network who loved it, like Hunt Stromberg Jr. and Mike Dan. Sherwood says that Aubrey unsuccessfully pestered him to change the whole show right up till the time it was premiered. Other CBS brass started meddling as well, and by the time they finished with Sherwood's idea, it looked like nothing he had intended. One guy wanted the show to involve the Ss Minnow charter boat setting out on a new adventure cruise each week with guest stars, and this was years before the Love Boat set sail. Another executive pushed the intelligent idea of having Gilligan befriend a talking dinosaur on the other side of the island. It would be another Mr. Ed. Sherwood nearly pulled his hair out at every meeting. His perseverance paid off, and he began making his pilot just about the way he wanted to in a remote section of Kauai, Hawaii, not far from some of the tropical paradise background seen in the film South Pacific. At a cost of $175,000, the pilot was completed and shipped to New York for approval with hopes for a purchase by the network. They hated it. It was rejected and returned with no explanation. Sherwood reclaimed the actual reels of film and redid the pilot. He recast the parts of the Professor, Ginger, and Mary Ann, re-edited the pilot with a new theme song, and resubmitted it to CBS. The test audiences loved it. In fact, CBS tested the pilot over and over again to see if there were a problem with the audience. The network was bewildered by the overwhelming appeal. At the 11th hour, Jim Audrey conceded and put this uncharted island on the network map for the fall 1964 season. Casting was a headache, says Sherwood. Although he had a few people in mind for these roles, like Jim Backus and Natalie Schaefer for Mr. and Mrs. Howell, he came up blank for Gilligan, the skipper, Ginger, and the rest. Originally, Sherwood pursued Jerry Van Dyke for the part of Willie Gilligan. That was Sherwood's intended first name for Gilligan if it were necessary to mention one. It never came up on any episode, however. Jerry Van Dyke rejected the idea and was known for many years as a star of the worst show on television, something called My Mother the Car. Nearly 25 years later, he became a big hit in Coach, which completely revitalized his career. The William Morris office suggested Bob Denver for Gilligan, and after meeting this television beatnik, Sherwood put his skepticism aside and thought, this guy might work. Casting the skipper was agonizing, Sherwood says, because it was imperative that the relationship between Gilligan and the skipper have perfect chemistry. Sherwood explained, I knew the skipper would be yelling at Gilligan all the time, and as it turned out, hitting him on the head with his hat. I needed somebody who could sincerely play a skipper who would remain lovable and warm no matter how much he yelled at his true friend Gilligan. Sherwood wrote a test scene that had the skipper ripping Gilligan apart. He figured if any actor survived that with some decency and integrity intact, then that would be Jonas Grumby, also known as the skipper. Even old Archie Bunker didn't look right. It's true, Harold O'Connor was among the many heavy-set men who tested for the role. Jim Backus took a gamble and agreed to play Thurston Howell III, only if CBS doubled its offer. Sherwood and the network knew Jim was fantastic for the part, so CBS immediately approved the request and picked up the extra funds. Jim had worked with Sherwood on radio and TV and took the role without even reading the script. I figured if it's good enough for Sherwood, it's good enough for me, Jim said. So when we got on this little plane to Hawaii to film the pilot, I found out that my part was, the wine list was longer. And Sherwood said, don't worry, we'll fix it up. So between us, we sat there and figured out some pretty good rich gags and such. Now, it was getting close to the time to depart for Hawaii, and Sherwood still didn't have a skipper. Then one night, Sherwood and his wife Mildred were out for dinner and saw Alan Hale Jr. from across the restaurant. That's him. Sherwood knew it. The tale of the first fateful trip. Imagine this. You're an actor, and you land a role in a series. You make the pilot, and then the officials look at it and approve it only after they've singled you out and said, but we don't want you. That's bloody devastating. Only Sherwood Schwartz and maybe a few network executives know the real reason why 3 of the roles were recast. And I must be careful what I say here because I don't want to offend anyone. For many years, I protected the actors who originally played Ginger, Mary Ann, and the Professor. In interviews, people would ask me who played the original Professor, and I'd say, I don't know. But I knew who he was, and I knew his work. When Turner Broadcasting unearthed this half-hour pilot film from its vaults and premiered it on October 16, 1992, on TBS, the world finally found out who these rejected actors were. John Gabriel played the high school teacher known as the Professor. A blonde actress named Kit Smythe played Ginger, and Nancy McCarthy played Bunny, a secretary. There was no Mary Ann yet. If you get an opportunity to see the pilot, you may agree with me when I note the difference between the Professor in the pilot and my Professor. I think my Professor, Roy Hinckley, was more of a reassuring man. Also, Ginger and Bunny were not played anything like the characters Tina Louise and Dawn Wells enacted. Friday, November 22, 1963, was the last day of filming on the beach at Maloa Bay. It was late in the morning when someone came running down to the company and said that they had just heard on the radio that President Kennedy had been shot. Filming staggered on, Sherwood recalls. No one could believe the news. Between scenes, everyone crowded on the radio listening to news bulletins while tears streamed from their eyes. The next thing they heard was that Lyndon Johnson was being sworn in as president, and they all knew there was no miscommunication. An eerie proof of that day can be seen in any of the first season's black and white episodes. Don't blink when you watch the opening scene from any of those shows. In the harbor where the Ss Minnow set sail, there was a flag flying at half-mast in the background. Natalie Schaefer says when she got back from Hawaii, she completely forgot about the pilot. I guess it was Christmas time or New Year's that I went down to Puerto Vallarta with a group of friends, and my mother was very ill at the time, she said. I was very nervous about going away at the time, and I thought something might happen to her. My friends convinced me that the trip would be good for me. One day, we were sitting having drinks at the hotel when a telegram was brought to me. I opened it and burst into tears. Everyone thought it was my mother, and they all came around me and said, "Don't worry, we'll get you back." And I cried and said, No, the series sold. CBS put Sherwood's Island on the air, and Dawn, Tina, and I joined the cast. Sherwood fought the network's strange decision to air Two on a Raft, the second episode filmed, as the premiere show on September 26, 1964, as it made sense that the pilot, for which we shot new scenes at Zuma Beach, California, should air first to tell the story of the shipwreck. Later on, Sherwood utilized some of the pilot's footage in the first season's Christmas show, the 12th episode, Birds Gotta Fly, Fish Gotta Talk, in which the cast flashes back to their first day on the island. A very strange bleeper is in that episode. Look very closely at the scene of Gilligan sleeping on the boat, waking up when he hears the skipper calling him. The other passengers asleep on the boat are clearly the original Professor, Ginger, and Bunny. No one caught that. Testing. Raquel Welch as Mary Ann. Dabney Coleman playing the Professor. Believe it or not, Raquel Welch and Dabney Coleman tested for roles at Gilligan's Island, but they weren't chosen to take the 3-hour tour on TV's Titanic, as the show has been called many times. I was this close to missing the boat myself. I rejected the offer to make a test film for it twice before I gave in. Why? Well, I guess it was ego. I was waiting for Godot, not Gilligan. Just before Gilligan's Island got underway, the roles of the Professor, Mary Ann, and Ginger were being recast. My agent, Sid Gold, called me twice, advising me that Hal Cooper, a friend of mine, had suggested to Sherwood Schwartz that I might be suitable as the Professor in this bizarre show the network had purchased. Sid urged me to go in and make the test, but I didn't want to. I was at a point in my career where I was being considered for the lead in a television series. I had already co-starred in Black Saddle for 2 years on the network. I was 39 years old. It was deciding time. It was time to make a move. What really held me back was that I had been seriously considered for the role of Dr. Ben Casey. Jim Mosier, the creator of Ben Casey, liked my audition, but I lost out to Vince Edwards. A little later on, I had made a pilot film with Jane Powell, a former child actress from MGM, and it was about Powell, now a grown woman who was in show business, and I played her husband, a college professor. It didn't sell. Really, I was waiting for something else. I was waiting for my shot, and the idea of being one of 7 didn't appeal to me at all. Sid Gold agreed that my role of a lifetime had not yet come along. The offer still stood, but again, I refused Sherwood Schwartz, and that went on for weeks. And Sid called again, telling me that Sherwood really wanted me to come in and at least test. What have you got to lose? I gave in. It was not the caliber of work I was searching for, but I went in and tried out for the cameras. Alan Hale was in the studio waiting for me with script in hand. There was a little 5-minute scene the skipper and I did for the cameras against a blank background. At that time, the show's sets had not been built. The producers just wanted to see what I looked like on camera, my presence on film, my delivery. Meanwhile, there were streams of women testing opposite Bob Denver for the roles of Mary Ann and Ginger. Raquel Welch was one of the women who read for Mary Ann, not Ginger, as you might think. Eventually, Dawn Wells was handed the role of Mary Ann, and someone for Ginger had yet to be chosen. When I went home after the test, I looked at my wife, at my 2 kids, at my house up in the hills in Studio City, and I wasn't making millions of dollars so that I could go on forever without working. I had to work, so I figured I'd better accept this damn thing. I had to sign a preliminary contract with the studio even before the test. This was standard because the producers didn't want actors holding them up once they got the role. The stage manager working on my test was a friend of mine, Sam Gary, whom I had known from way back. He did me the favor of arranging the order of the tests because I wasn't the only guy the network executives were looking at. Sam assembled the films with particular strategy. First he put a pretty good test, then a lousy test, then me, and then finally a mediocre test. He positioned me just right, and the powers that be chose me. Ethel Wynett, CBS's head of casting, called me to say the role was mine. Ethel was a petite woman, strong and intelligent, who later went on to PBS and did wonderful things there. It was highly unusual at that time to have a woman in such a powerful position at a network. There wasn't even a woman's restroom in the offices when she started at CBS. She had to use the men's room and leave her high heels outside the door so everyone would know she was in the bathroom. But it was easy to see why Ethel was there. She was one tough cookie and she knew what she was doing. And fortunately, my wife Kay and I had known Ethel for years. When Ethel called to inform me of a very strange request, she simply laid it on the line. "Look, Russell, I've got to talk to you. Hunt Stromberg wants to see you in his office, and he wants you stripped down to your shorts." "What the hell does that mean?" I asked her. "Hunt wants to see what you look like so we can make a final decision." She was speaking of Hunt Stromberg, Jr., the West Coast Vice President for Program Development at CBS. He was an integral force in getting Gilligan's Island on the air, so Sherwood asked me to appease him in any way I possibly could. I only go so far, however. I had heard about other actors who had filmed tests for him in their underwear, but I was not going to join that lineup. I told Ethel to forget it. I could be very frank with her. "Look, I'm a serious actor," I said in our phone conversation. "You know me. I'm not interested. I'm fit. I have a good body." Ethel said, "I know you do. But why not just go and meet with him?" I told her that if a personal pique is what it took to get the part, I'd decline. Later in the day, Ethel called me again and said, "I'll tell you what. If you come to my office and take your shirt off, I'll tell Hunt I saw you, and that will be that." So I agreed. When I got to CBS, Ethel stood there looking at me with my shirt clenched in my hand and a smile on my face. We laughed about it. "I know this is ridiculous, but I'm going to take a Polaroid and just give this to him. Will that be all right?" I smiled for the camera, and that was the end of it. The last character to be cast was Ginger. The whole process became so involved it grew legs and became a monster, Ethel says. Her casting search extended from one coast to the other. We tested every girl we could find for Ginger, but nobody looked quite right until we found Tina Louise, who was in a Broadway play at the time. It was Ethel who orchestrated the contract release for Tina so she could move from New York to Los Angeles and start in the series. Finally, on June 9, 1964, Tina signed a contract with CBS, and Sherwood had his 7 stranded castaways. Problems rose almost immediately. They told me the series was about a movie star who got stranded on an island with a few others, Tina says. She hesitantly agreed to perform the role because she was bound by her contract. As Ginger, she says she was told that she would be the star of Gilligan's Island, and the rest of us would be the supporting cast. Tina says that originally, Ginger was described to her as a Marilyn Monroe, Lucille Ball type. Sherwood Schwartz shakes his head at that one. Marilyn Monroe, maybe, he says, but the only resemblance to Lucy would be the color of their hair. We gathered for the first reading of our first show at the CBS studios in a conference room around a huge table with Sherwood Schwartz at the helm. I looked around, and this is what I saw. Across the table was my friend Alan Hale, whom I had worked with in his series Casey Jones several years earlier. He ended up being the rock of our show. And there was Bob Denver, a fine comic actor who had made me laugh when I watched The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis on television. Sitting next to me was a beautiful girl with big brown eyes named Dawn Wells, so sweet and charming and sexy. And Tina Louise, the other beauty on the show, tall and with flowing red hair. Dear Natalie Schaefer sat next to her co-star, Jim Backus. They acted as if they had known each other for years, but it had only been a few months. Natalie was a funny lady, down-to-earth, yet elegant and intelligent. And, of course, the great Jim Backus, Mr. Magoo, with his long list of film credits. Next to Sherwood was our director, John Rich, one of the best in the business. He had just completed directing 2 seasons of the popular Dick Van Dyke Show, and he was going to be our co-producer as well as our director. Our creator, Sherwood Schwartz, whom I came to know as a first-class gentleman, was a man who cared about his work and about his actors. It was clear that this man was hard-working and willing to listen to our ideas. Maybe we had something, after all. Alan Hale was just as he appeared on the show. A bear-huggy kind of guy. He was a big man with a tight frame and a gliding broad stride in his walk. He was agile, lovable, and sincere, and these qualities were topped with a bubbly, outgoing jolliness that you rarely see in people, except maybe Santa Claus. These qualities made him very approachable, That was his public persona, and it's why it was such a pleasure to work with him every day. Alan and I were very good friends on the set, but I don't know what he was like at home. I'm sure he had a full range of emotions as any human being. His wife, Trinket, says he had a private fragileness about him that not many people saw. In the course of Gilligan's Island, I had Alan and Trinket over for dinner a few times, and my experiences with him were always memorable. On the set, he was 100% pro and a good spirit, always. And over the years, it was amazing. But one thing stuck out: this guy never seemed to age. Very simply, Alan made me feel good when I was around him. He had an infectious, deep, hearty laugh that you could recognize across a large room. It was on a sound level all its own, booming over everybody else's laughter. Alan was an encompassing kind of person, and he had a lot of friends because he grew up in Hollywood in a family that was rooted in the entertainment business. He loved to host parties and have friends and fans stop by to see him at his West Hollywood restaurant, Alan Hale's Lobster Barrel, with which he was associated for about 15 years after Gilligan's Island ended. I think that everybody who ever worked with Alan loved him. He seemed to know everybody in town: John Wayne, Betty Davis, Jimmy Stewart, James Cagney, John Ford. His father was a successful actor in films dating back to the silent days of Valentino and D.W. Griffith. The senior Hale had worked with Errol Flynn in a few motion pictures, and he played Little John in The Adventures of Robin Hood. And he was the fellow driving in the car that picks up Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert in the Frank Capra classic It Happened One Night. I think Alan regretted not being able to work with his father in the craft they shared. They were supposed to do an RKO movie together called At Swords Point, but suddenly Alan's father died just before the production began in 1950. Alan's respect and love for his father was evident. If you'll look closely, you'll notice a reminder of his father in every episode of Gilligan's Island. Alan faithfully wore an emerald and diamond pinky ring that had belonged to his father. There's no question that Alan Hale, Jr. will be best remembered as the skipper. He immortalized that very nautical rank. What other skipper is there? It was such a fitting role for him because Alan Hale, Jr. was of the sea. He believed he had a karma with it. After all, he was a Pisces who loved and respected the sea, and when the time came, he said he wanted to be cremated and have his ashes scattered at sea. Alan was nearly 68 years old when he died on January 2nd, 1990, leaving his wife, 4 children, and a long list of film and television credits, and more fans than can be counted. The last time I saw Alan was on one of our personal appearances together in New York. After the appearance, Bob, Dawn, Alan, and I were all taken to the airport in a limousine, and when we arrived at the main terminal of JFK, we all said our goodbyes right there because our flights were jetting off in different directions. I didn't know what was wrong with him at the time, but it was evident that he was ill because of his drastic weight loss. And I kept asking Bob, "What's wrong with Alan?" And Bob said, "I don't know, he won't discuss it." My last glimpse of Alan was watching him walk through the terminal toward his gate. As usual, he was wearing his cap and carrying a small bag over his shoulder, and I stood there and watched him for a while. Alan walked very slowly, and he slumped over a bit. I knew that he was a sick man. It saddened me. Trinket said Alan was sick almost 2 years before anyone knew it. He carried his illness with dignity. He even hid it from her until she found a string of doctor's bills for treatment of cancer of the thymus. Trinket remembers Alan's last day. In the hospital, Alan said to me, "Honey, you remember what I want, don't you?" And I assured him that I did. When Alan died, I was in the room with his sister and the hospital priest. Right outside his room, you could see a church steeple in the distance. I looked out the window at the steeple and prayed that if he couldn't get well, that God would take him. I hoped he would take him at sunset. Alan would have wanted that. By that time, Alan was unconscious and peaceful. Honest, just as the sun went down, Alan opened his eyes and looked at me, and I leaned into him and said, "I love you." And then he took a deep breath, and he died. The priest said, "I think we've all just witnessed a miracle." Dawn called me in the morning when she found out that Alan had died. Dawn was like a daughter to him, and I knew it was crushing for her. She had been to the hospital to see him the day before, and she said she knew it wouldn't be long. All of us felt the loss of a dear friend. Later on, I found out that although the Coast Guard had called Trinket and offered a full military service at sea, she declined and thanked them for their kindness. Trinket fulfilled Alan's wishes through the Neptune Society. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea. And wouldn't you know it, a helicopter from one of the tabloids hovered above, photographing the whole thing. Trinket arranged an intimate ceremony on a charter boat with family and friends gathered, and Dawn represented all of us from the show. After some passages from the Bible were read, his ashes were distributed and flowers were scattered on the water. The skipper was at sea. I miss Alan. Bob Denver couldn't be more different from Gilligan, which attests to the fact that he's one fine actor. He is not bumbling or inept or stupid like Gilligan. He is a highly intelligent, well-read gentleman who takes his work very seriously. He was not at all flip about the silly things he had to do as Gilligan. All of his actions, every nuance, every giggle, every gesture, every movement were well calculated and executed with unshakable confidence. Now I ask you, does that sound like Gilligan? Bob has an inborn sense of comedic timing that you can't give to anybody, and Gilligan's Island proved to audiences what an accomplished, gifted actor he is. Bob and I are good friends, but I wouldn't say we're bosom buddies. We've always been more businesslike, but on a warm, friendly basis. I've always admired Bob for his talent, and I think that his wife, Dreama, whom he married after the show ended, really changed his life for the better. And Bob is a family man with beautiful daughters who just love their father. Bob and Dreama have a young, disabled son, and it's inspiring to see the dedication they have to his well-being and happiness. Bob was a grade school teacher before he decided to make a go of it as an actor. He has a degree in political science from Loyola University, and for a time studied law there as well. While he was at Loyola, he discovered the Del Rey Players, and began working with this theater group in a part in the Caine Mutiny. When he graduated, he found that jobs were not easy to obtain, so he taught history and arithmetic at Corpus Christi Children's School in Pacific Palisades, California. On the side, he coached football, basketball, boys and girls, and baseball. Then he suddenly came into a very good thing. He was cast as the lazy beatnik, Maynard G. Krebs, which for a while was his most famous role. It's still popular with fans of The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, which continues to rerun today. And directly after that series ended, Bob slid into the Lagoon. Although Bob later did Broadway, replacing Woody Allen in Play It Again, Sam, and a string of motion pictures, he's now resigned to the fact that he'll always be known either as Maynard or Gilligan. In the past 15 years, he has reprised both characters for TV reunion movies, with ambivalence, I know. When we reunited for The Rescue from Gilligan's Island TV movie, Bob was 43, and he once again slipped into his long-sleeved red rugby shirt and bleached-out bell-bottoms. He colored his graying hair and put on the rumpled white cap for another adventure as one of the original boat people. He did a fantastic job and philosophized, "You can't go back and capture what you did. Not really. I don't care when you try." Many times since then, Bob has been seen in both motion pictures and television as Gilligan. I think in the back of his mind, he wishes he weren't so indelibly associated with Gilligan. At the same time, I think he's grateful for the recognition. He knows Gilligan's Island is an inseparable part of Americana now. Jim Backus had a sense of humor that could be pretty raunchy sometimes, but not as risque as he intended for the voice of his famous cartoon character, the myopic curmudgeon Mr. Magoo. He used to say, "The best of Magoo has to be censored." Jim was notorious for ad-libbing when we filmed. Not all of it was off-color, but most of it was just plain hilarious. He'd tack on a line or mumble a wisecrack, or he'd let out a Magoo-like bark that would have everybody in hysterics. He'd come up with a quick line or just a weird sound out of the blue that would just kill you. Some of that stuff had to be edited out. The scraps were combined with the rest of our filmed blunders for an outtake reel that was shown at the Christmas party. Boy, would I like to have one of those reels now. One way to describe Jim's humor and his demeanor off-camera is to compare his outrageousness with that of Jonathan Winters or Robin Williams, just less hyper. It was wonderful to hear Jim reminisce about working in films and television with people like James Dean and Humphrey Bogart. I respected his resume. His background in show business stretched back to the radio days, where his Thurston Howell originated. Howell was a refinement of his similarly snobbish radio character, Hubert Updike III, on The Alan Young Show. Basically the same voice, many of the same gags, and both sickeningly rich. Before Sherwood Schwartz lured him into recreating that character, Jim had appeared in quite a few guest spots on television. He starred opposite Joan Davis as the sedate judge Bradley Stevens in I Married Joan, which lasted 3 years. Mr. Magoo had his own string of cartoons that have been well received since the 1950s. And in motion pictures, Jim made his mark in a few classics like Rebel Without a Cause and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, in which he played the drunken airplane pilot Tyler Fitzgerald, his favorite film role. In all, he did over 50 films. After we filmed The Rescue from Gilligan's Island, Jim got sick. All of a sudden, it seemed as if he had become a frail old man. He needed assistance to walk and move, and it seemed as if he were drained of energy. He was very thin, and to a layman, his illness seemed like a stroke. His mind was there, but physically he had a lot of problems. Evidently, he had been suffering from a complication of afflictions that included agoraphobia, an abnormal fear of going out in public, and Parkinson's disease. The whole thing wiped him out. As he described in Bacchus Strikes Back, a charming book he wrote in 1984 with his wife Henny, he was unable to coordinate his arms and legs, tie a tie, or even hold a fork. He did strike back to some extent, but the old Jim Bacchus never reappeared. When he was approached about recording some new Magoos for Saturday morning TV, he nearly declined out of fear and anxiety. Henny urged him to take the work, and with hesitation, old Magoo had done it again. What brought him through his emotional and physical illnesses over the years was Henny's devotion. She kept him alive, kept him going, and struggled to keep his spirits up, even though Jim's health was like a roller coaster for nearly 10 years. Around Hollywood, they were known as quite a team, and theirs was a great love story. Jim Bacchus was the first of our cast to pass away. He died on July 3rd, 1989. I prefer to remember the healthy, happy Jim, whom I had known and enjoyed spending time with. Natalie Schaefer was a mystery to me at first. Here was this society lady who at first glance seemed kind of phony. She seemed like a typical snooty Broadway diva, complete with a lorgnette. You know those opera glasses with a long handle? She really used them for nearsightedness. And very quickly I began to realize I had a mistaken impression. Once I got to know her, what emerged was a charming, funny, elegant lady who cared deeply about others. Natalie was a woman who was very beautiful in her time. She had had a career in the theater long before she arrived in Hollywood and began making films at MGM, so her initial apprehension about Gilligan's Island, that silly thing on TV, was understandable. Natalie was married just once, to actor Louis Calhern, in the 30s, and even after their divorce in the 40s, they remained good friends. There's a funny story, actually, about Calhern's last wish. Literally, on his deathbed, he pleaded with Natalie to finally reveal her age to him. She looked him in the eye and said, "Never." That was the thing with Natalie. None of us ever knew how old she was when we worked together, nor did it really matter. When she died, we were all astounded at her age. She never looked her age, and certainly she didn't act it. I remember Natalie telling me about the time she visited the doctor for a mandatory physical. She had to have a checkup for the studio's insurance, so she went back to the same doctor who had examined her years before. He asked her, "Natalie, how old are you now?" She said, "How old was I last time?" There are a lot of famous Hollywood stories about Natalie. Some are rooted in truth, others in fiction. Whichever she decided at the time, she was retelling them. One tale she did tell on herself was of her great romance with the famous playwright George S. Kaufman while he was still married. It seems she was Kaufman's mistress. Evidently, after Natalie made her first film at MGM, Reunion in France, 1942, Louis B. Mayer called her in to persuade her to sign a contract. He told Natalie, "We need somebody with dignity like you, a lady of elegance. We'll make you a star in motion pictures." Natalie told Mayer she would love to, but she lived in New York and she was in love. Mayer said it would be no problem to bring her beau out to California as well, and she said, "Well, I don't think his wife would like that." Mayer was shocked. He read her the riot act and said, "My God, I thought you were a lady. You're having an affair with a married man. Get out." And she never signed on Mayer's dotted line. Later on, when Natalie became Lovey Howell, it was evident why Sherwood had personally selected her. She was very much like Mrs. Howell. She dressed with great taste, and she enjoyed the best of both worlds, or coasts, you might say. During all the years I knew her, Natalie maintained a very nice Park Avenue apartment in Manhattan, and she owned a house on Rodeo Drive in posh Beverly Hills. In both homes, she stocked a small bar, and she loved to host parties. Natalie's most notable attribute was her trademark rich accent. That authentic accent, particularly some words, did not come easily when we were filming. Natalie showed up to work prepared, but she toiled over her Gilligan scripts and struggled to learn her lines each week, more so than any of us, I think. She was just that kind of actor for whom memorization is definitely not instantaneous. Natalie lived mostly at her home in Beverly Hills when she wasn't working, and enjoyed spending time with friends who regularly popped over to chat, have a drink, and gossip. And Natalie hated being alone, but as long as she had her tiny dogs, she was content. Sherwood remembered she was never without a little dog. She had one that lived to be 15, I think, and it was named Lovey. The last 4 or 5 years of Natalie's life, she had a cute little French poodle named Fifi, who was too small to jump up on her bed. So Natalie had a ramp specially made so Fifi could walk up this ramp and get into bed with her at night. Nothing fazed Natalie. She didn't hesitate to tell many people, including reporters, that although she had had a mastectomy many years ago, she never failed to swim nude in her pool every morning, wearing just a cap for her hair and gloves so the sun wouldn't cause age spots on her hands. She had no fear of intrusion because of the high wooden fences that surrounded the back of her California property. Because of a recurring back ailment in her last few years, Natalie found solace from her extreme pain by fixing a Bloody Mary in the mornings, and when she felt the need, something more potent. There was an inconspicuous book wedged in among the rest in her small library. It was simply titled Joy, and Natalie loved to have joy in the morning. But a few of us weren't sure what she meant. We found out later there was a little flask secretly hidden inside the hollowed-out hardback. I loved Natalie's sense of humor off-screen. She was a determined, feisty woman who did exactly what she wanted. Just when you felt comfortable, she'd blurt out a shocking 4-letter word just to catch you off guard, and yet she retained her femininity. On April 10, 1990, Natalie died in her sleep. She was 90 years young. Tina Louise was puzzling. She made it known when we were filming the series, and she says it more often today, that she didn't like playing fiery Ginger Grant, but on the other hand, she was stunningly perfect in the role. When our show began drawing good audiences, we were all approached about making cast appearances on the state and county fair circuit. The money would have been phenomenal for all of us. In just a few weekends of appearances, we could have made thousands. The offer was for all 7 of us, or no offer at all. But for some reason, Tina was definitely not interested. I must say, Tina's a damn good actress, and we were lucky to have her in our ensemble because the role of Ginger was so difficult to cast. It had to be played just right. Not many people know that Tina studied acting with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York at the same time as Joanne Woodward and a group of other talented students. Tina did some fantastic acting on the show. That's not Tina on the screen, that's Ginger Grant, the femme fatale of the island. It's been said that Ginger Grant was the TV version of Marilyn Monroe. In fact, Tina might have been inspired by Marilyn when she played Ginger. Ginger was the first vamp introduced to boys and girls on television. Although there may be similarities between Tina the actress and Ginger the island movie queen, the two are definitely distinct. Born Tina Blacker in New York City, she wasn't given a middle name. It wasn't until her acting teacher in high school gave her the name Louise, and Tina liked it so much that she eventually adopted Louise as a professional name. In interviews, Tina has described her childhood as very rigid and sometimes unhappy. Currently, she's thinking about putting her memories into a book that she'd like to call Sundays. Embracing the art of acting, Tina studied diligently in New York after she graduated from high school. Her talents landed her some choice roles on Broadway and off-Broadway. She appeared in The Fifth Season in 1953 and Lil Abner in 1956. In 1964, she was co-starring with Carol Burnett in Broadway's Fade Out, Fade In, when she exited the show to move to California and become one of the 7 shipwrecked on a sitcom. During the series, Tina was married to talk show host Les Crane Jr., a pioneer in the audience participation format that Phil Donahue has made popular. You know, the same blab-it-all style that runs amok on television these days. I remember Crane's talk show because he had a microphone mounted on a gun stock, like a shotgun, and he'd point it at people, trying to elicit their reaction to some topic of the day. I couldn't believe it. Tina and Crane were divorced while she was pregnant, and it took a lot of courage to raise a child as a single parent who was also trying to succeed in show business. Today it's evident that Tina is proud of the close-knit relationship she has with her lovely daughter Caprice, now in her 20s. And it was Caprice who rekindled in her mom a little fascination for the old island after so many years. Career-wise, Tina says she's most proud of her work in God's Little Acre, Friendships, Secrets and Lies, and The Stepford Wives. She's also very proud of her dramatic performance in an episode of Kojak in which he played a drug addict. There have been a variety of roles that have come her way, but lingering in people's imagination is Ginger Grant. People may assume Tina is violently opposed to Ginger, but now I think it's merely mild combat. Some of the reason for this partial reversal may be that Tina really hasn't changed much in her appearance over the years, which I'm sure pleases her. Fans recognize her daily. She still looks beautiful, and she's worked hard to maintain her figure. She still has the beauty mole on her left cheek and the flowing Titian hair. Red is not a color I like, Tina says. Dawn Wells has been called pure Americana. Think of it. Her great-grandfather drove a stagecoach from Reno to Virginia City during the gold rush. She was Miss Nevada competing for the 1960 Miss America title. And we know her best as Mary Ann Summers, the homespun sweetheart from Horner's Corners, Kansas, who lovingly baked coconut cream pies for 6 others stranded with her on an uncharted desert island. Dawn was the cast member who received the most fan mail while we were making Gilligan's Island. There was something of an innocent, fresh, approachable, wholesome allure to Mary Ann. In many ways, pigtailed Mary Ann in the gingham dress was patterned after Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You can't get much more Americana than that. This whole fascination was a surprise to Dawn, who assumed that the most beautiful character on the show was Ginger. As one writer put it, Ginger Grant could make men swoon, a perfumed beauty in slinky gowns. But Mary Ann was a breath of fresh air in sporty short shorts, the girl next door. You may be glad to know that Dawn Wells has always been very much like Mary Ann, kind, gentle, extremely good with children. I think it's a shame Dawn didn't have any kids of her own, and I know she regrets it herself. She has said so. She was married for a few years while we were doing the series, but that ended shortly after our show did, and Dawn has remained single ever since. I guess if I had to identify the one I was closest to in the cast, it would be Dawn. We've always shared a mutual fondness for one another. It was always platonic. At the outset, we were both neglected in the opening credits and referred to as the rest, and our roles were about the same size in the beginning. As time went by, I think the producers and writers began to realize that the Professor and Mary Ann were the lone voices of logic. We were very important to the show, and they expanded our parts. Offstage, Dawn and I used to run lines together, and for me, that was a godsend because of those technical explanations. Dawn has said that the show was her training ground, but she could have fooled me. She didn't appear naive or inexperienced at all. In fact, I remember that somehow Dawn became a human bulletin board for the cast. She was the one who knew exactly where each one of us was to be during the day, what scenes were going to be shot, and what the schedule for the week entailed. If there were any questions, the remedy was simple. Ask Dawn. Originally, Dawn did not intend to become an actress. When she was growing up in Reno, Nevada, she took dancing lessons to be a ballerina. Trick knees made her look for something else. At Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri, an all-girls school located smack in the center of the state, Dawn started out as a chemistry major, later leaning toward theater training. When she graduated, her first role was in a play. Dawn portrayed a 14-year-old boy, if you can believe that. In Hollywood, she slid into television roles, and knock on wood, she says, she's not been out of work since, except by choice. After Gilligan's, Dawn returned to the theater to stretch a bit, fearing the same typecasting we all did. Her home base was Nashville for many years, and in 1987, Dawn moved back to the Los Angeles area, where she continues to stay active in theater. Dawn was the youngest of all the cast, and I think we all had our special friendship with her. She's that type of person. I think late in Natalie Schaefer's life, Dawn became like a daughter to her. A few years ago, Dawn began a small business venture called Wishing Wells, which distributes a catalog featuring a clothing line for people who have difficulty dressing themselves, like arthritis sufferers or the elderly who may be infirm. Dawn laughs when she says she gets letters from people who say, "Oh, I just knew Mary Ann would end up doing something nice like that." E = mc². One thing people ask me is how close the professor was to my real personality. Maybe they believe the television and assume that I really am that island intellectual with an IQ just points away from Einstein's. These same people may find it amusing to know that I flunked a few subjects in high school and was held back a half a year. My father's death shaped the events of my life for many years. I was 8 years old when my father died of pneumonia. In the midst of the Great Depression of the 1930s, my mother was left to raise 6 kids in Ashley, Pennsylvania. Someone told her about a school in Philadelphia called Girard College that was for poor white male orphans. It was established in 1850 by Stephen Girard, a Frenchman. And let me point out that many years earlier, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania characterized any fatherless child as an orphan. My mother had the courage to do what she thought was right for us, and I've come to realize what a difficult position she was in and what a good job she did. She was a great woman. I loved her, and I miss her. So a few months after my father's death, my younger brothers, Kenneth, David, and I, were admitted to Girard College all on the same day. I spent the majority of my youth within those tall stone walls. I lived and grew up there. It was pretty hard for an 8-year-old to lose his father, to be torn away from his home, separated from his mother, and placed in an institution where he was one of 1,800 boys. There were huge buildings and long rooms with spotless wooden floors and an overwhelming militarized feeling about the whole place. But also, there was a lot of warmth. It took a long time to get used to our sudden uprooting because at Girard we were scared, not only of the other guys, but of the disciplinarians as well. This fear surfaced when we saw boys getting hit and knocked about, and we wondered what was going on, and then came to the realization that sooner or later it could happen to us. So we learned how to play the game, how to get along in a situation like that and survive. Because my father was working for the Reading Railroad when he died, we could take advantage of free passes. We went back and forth by train between Philadelphia and Ashley. It's about 125 miles apart during our vacations, 10 days at Christmas and 2 months in the summer. But even before we could leave, my mother had to prove that she could support us for the 60 days. In a lot of ways, I wish my childhood had been different. I wish I had had a father whom I knew, but that didn't happen. I wanted to be closer to my mother, but it was a double-edged situation. I knew I couldn't be. One thing Girard insisted on was that you write a letter every Sunday to your mother. And I did that. If anything, I learned a bit of self-discipline during my childhood. At a very early age, I learned how to hide my feelings. In essence, how to act. I was flunking algebra when I was a sophomore in high school. Algebra just didn't register with me. I couldn't grasp it. And in those days, if you flunked one subject, you went to summer school. If you flunked 2, you went to summer school. Failing 3 courses meant you were held back for a term, but you could go home for the summer. I knew I was flunking algebra, and there was no way to salvage my grades, so I deliberately flunked 2 other subjects, social studies and I think history. I wanted to go home for the summer because summer was escape time, and nobody was going to deprive me of that. Up until that point, I was a C and D student. After I was held back, I made a decision that I was not going to be that kind of student anymore. It was a conscious decision that I repeated in my mind. I even said it aloud a few times. From that point on, I concentrated. I became an A student, and I was elected to the National Honor Society. I was a leader in every way I could be at Girard. I became a captain in the cadet battalion, and I led our company to a competitive drill championship. I played a decent game at almost any sport, and at that time, I formulated an interest in acting. I don't know whether I dug deep into my life experiences for the role of Professor Roy Hinckley. I was not the smartest in our school, but I remember the guy who was. His name was Walter Hartfield, and he was one of 66 guys in my class. Believe me, he was the brain all the way through school, and he played the piano exceptionally well. Walter gave many recitals for the students. In 1992, I returned to Girard's campus for my class's 50th reunion. The school is still operating, albeit with changes. Today it is multiracial and coeducational, and the enrollment is much smaller. A lot of emotions went through me during that trip, and I'm glad my wife was with me to reminisce with old friends. A few even asked me to sign autographs for their grandchildren, and that made me feel terrific. For all of us who grew up in the confines of Girard, there were shared feelings of the whole range of emotions, including respect and love for our school and for our benefactor, Stephen Girard. I also found out that Walter Hartfield had died, but who knows? Maybe a little bit of Walter lives on in the professor. Features of the black-topped lagoon. There were mornings during the California winter months that chilled the lagoon to a crisp 40 degrees, and when you jumped in, the shock almost took your breath away. Many times Bob had to wear a wetsuit under his jeans and red rugby shirt, with the collar buttoned all the way up to conceal it. I wore one too, but it didn't work well, because we weren't moving around in the water that much, so it didn't contain much body heat. Some months the water felt great, and we did the shot in the afternoon when it was good and sweltering outside. Natalie would be the first to run in. But some months it was like jumping into a pool of melting ice, and you could tell that we hesitated in some scenes. For some reason, the icy water didn't bother Alan, so we used to kid him about being well-insulated. Poor Bob. Those lagoon scenes really got to him because he was in that murky water the most. I remember once it was just turning daylight, and we were all at the lagoon getting ready to do the outdoor shots before an afternoon storm rolled through Southern California. Bob had to lay at the bottom of the lagoon with a weight on his chest and wait for action to be called before he could sit up and say his lines for the camera. Take after take, he had to repeat it. That icy water was creeping into his wetsuit, and he was in the water shivering so long that he couldn't get his lines out. His lips were purple. He couldn't take it any longer, so he just walked up to his dressing room, turned on the shower, stepped in with his clothes on, tennis shoes, cap, everything still on. Steam floated out of Bob's dressing room, and you could hear him let out one of those sighs that go along with a hot, steaming, foaming jacuzzi. We shot Gilligan's Island on CBS's studio lot in the valley, 4 or 5 miles away from what is actually Hollywood. The lagoon was on the back lot. Everything else, every hut, cave, and dream was filmed indoors on Soundstage 2 with one camera and no audience. Eventually, the sand on Stage 2 was swept away, and that very same floor became the stomping grounds for Mary Tyler Moore and her cast when they filmed her hit show in the early 70s. When the huts and palm trees occupied Stage 2 for our South Seas sanctuary, a sky-blue cyclorama surrounded the back of the set. We had just a few interchangeable huts that were redressed to transform, say, the Howells hut into the Skipper and Gilligan's. I was usually stuck in the supply hut. There was greenery everywhere, in pots and buckets. Some palm trees were tied up with sacks around their bases. Some of our indoor palm trees were held up by planks that were nailed to the floor. An assortment of styrofoam boulders with flat bottoms were scattered around for decoration. It was a jungle, all right. People still ask about the lagoon. I think it took a few inspections and alterations before they got it right, but the CBS greensmen, designers, and contracted landscapers made this lagoon out of a corner chunk of land. Artificial palm trees that were bald of palm fronds were planted around the pool they were digging. Eventually, palm leaves were attached, and much more tropical greenery, some live, mostly plastic, was brought in. And then they blacktopped the lagoon's belly, pumped water in, and it leaked terribly. So they had to empty the lagoon, fix it, and fill it again. The lagoon was emptied and refilled a few times when the water got too dirty to jump in or to even look presentable for Gilligan to pass by and discover a NASA spacecraft or something. The only other interference we experienced while filming at the lagoon was the occasional airplane that rose from the nearby Burbank Airport and flew overhead. The lush lagoon, 4 feet deep, with a working waterfall, cost $75,000. There have been rumors that the lagoon was converted into a parking lot. However, as far as I know, our tropical paradise is still there at CBS. Oh, and don't be duped. Your tour guide on the tram at Universal Studios will tell you the lake you are passing was the lagoon for Gilligan's Island. What they don't say is that it was used only once in a TV reunion movie. For those of you who thought we never actually pinpointed the island on a map, well, here's your answer. You know that wavy shot of the island in the distance just as you're coming back from a commercial? You know the same island right behind the show's title? That was Coconut Island, one of Hawaii's tiniest. For those honeymooners who want to visit the most televised island in history, it's located in Kaneohe Bay on the northeast shore of Oahu. It also served as the location for the film Bird of Paradise. The Ballad of Gilligan's Island. It's probably true that more kids can recall the lyrics to the Gilligan's Island theme song than can recite our country's Pledge of Allegiance. It's also probable that our show's opening theme song is the most famous of all TV theme songs. And yet when Gilligan's Island was still under construction, the tune as we know it was not the first choice. In fact, it was out of sheer, painful desperation that the song came about at all. Sherwood Schwartz, who fully subscribed to that necessity is the mother of invention rule, sat right back and wrote the theme with a friend of his, only after receiving the devastating news that the network detested Gilligan's Island and refused to put it on the air. Sherwood was confident that with some alterations in editing, CBS would reconsider, and he knew that the show's opening was an elemental constituent in understanding the program's concept. While Sherwood was frantically retooling his pilot film for the network, he decided to replace the original Calypso theme, which was sung by one vocalist. Sherwood and his friend, composer George Wiley, penned a new opening. The song was written specifically to introduce the characters and explain, in capsule form, the shipwreck of the Ss Minnow. In doing so, Sherwood successfully followed the same strategy employed by other situation comedies of the day, like the storytelling Ballad of Jed Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies. Gilligan's one-minute ballad came about in a mad dash to complete the lyrics and melody, record it with a group of professional singers, and edit the whole thing with the pilot's film footage. It all had to be accomplished in time to screen the final print for network executives in New York. Because the song had to be recorded on a weekend and there were no recording studios available, Sherwood begged favors from friends to get it done in a couple of days. He hadn't even found a group to sing it yet. Finally, through Wiley, a group of hungry but very talented folk singers were chosen to record the theme. This was accomplished on a Sunday afternoon in a makeshift studio that had been quickly set up in a garage at the home of Sherwood's friend, writer-producer Mel Shavelson. While recording was going on, a dinner party was in preparation in the house. Just before the singers were ready for a take, someone would whistle and the clattering of dishes and plates all stopped. The hired waiters all had to freeze. With Sherwood's determination and luck, the track was recorded, albeit as primitive as could be. Barely making the deadline, the tape was cut together with the film, and the new pilot was flown to New York for another screening by the brass. And this time, they loved it. Strangely, until now, not much had been known about the three young, clean-cut folk singers who harmonized the vocals and played their guitars for our theme song that afternoon in a garage. They were a trio known as the Wellingtons, college buddies, all in their early 20s, who came from the University of Illinois. Their names were George Patterson, Kirby Johnson, and Ed Wade. Over the years, Sherwood had lost contact with them, and these guys seemed to have slipped into obscurity. As it turns out, they had eagerly ventured into the music industry in the early 60s, broken up in the late 60s, and after becoming like brothers over the years, had gone their separate ways. George Patterson became a respected psychologist. Ed Wade became a successful attorney and is now a partner in a large law firm. And Kirby Johnson stayed in the music business, arranging for the likes of Arlo Guthrie, Ike and Tina Turner, Carly Simon, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. When the Wellingtons were approached about singing the theme song to Gilligan's Island, they thought it would be fun, and they shared enthusiasm about getting further television exposure. But it wasn't something they thought would last. Unfortunately, for the second season of Gilligan's Island, the Wellingtons were replaced by another clean-sounding vocal group, the Eligibles, who sounded a lot like them. The new group recorded the theme song to eliminate "and the rest," and inserted an important addition to the lyrics: "The Professor and Mary Ann." Needless to say, Dawn and I felt we deserved that change in lyrics when it happened, but even more, it meant that our names and faces would be featured in the ship's wheel in the show's opening. But I'm not sure that any of us in the cast noticed that an entirely different music group re-recorded the theme song. Today, none of the former Wellington knows positively why he was replaced. George Patterson hazily recalled that they might have been approached about recording a cleaner, lyrically revised version of the Gilligan's theme for the second season's opening, but they were busy working with Donald O'Connor in Las Vegas at the time. Patterson vividly recalls the day when the fellows were approached with the idea of releasing the Gilligan's Island theme as a single because the show was doing so well. "We thought it was a stupid idea," he says. "Who could have known?" The Wellingtons were linked to our show for two reasons. They recorded the original theme song, and they guest starred as the Mosquitoes, a rock group that landed on the island in Don't Bug the Mosquitoes. That's where we finally met the guys who sang our theme song. Don't Bug the Mosquitoes. I don't remember a lot from this episode, except that Alan, Jim, and I had to get into these ridiculous costumes. We had wigs, wore tights and bright shirts, and played these bamboo guitars. And Bob was on drums. And Alan was in tights, which was hilarious. Every once in a while, the writers gave us a script that had Alan dressed in long underwear or a grass skirt or a toga. On him, it was especially funny, and he laughed right along with us. This time our rescue was ruined by our own ingenuity, not completely Gilligan's fault either. Here's how it went. The Mosquitoes, Bingo, Bango, Bongo, and Irving, America's hot new rock group, landed on the island for some R&R and to escape from their crazed fans. The castaways were so desperate to get back to civilization that they schemed to annoy the four singers so much that they would want to return to the mainland. That didn't work, so someone got the brilliant idea of assembling Mr. Howell, the skipper, and me as a new rock group on the island, and that didn't work. Now Ginger had the girls form a group called the Honeybees and do a number in matching go-go pants and boots. They sang a terrific song called You Need Us, like a clam needs a shell, like a prisoner needs a cell. The Honeybees ended up being too good, and their talent threatened the Mosquitoes, who fled the island without us, of course. About the professor. Name Dr. Roy Hinckley. Birthplace, Cleveland, Ohio. Education, 6 degrees in all, including a BA from USC, a BS from UCLA, an MA from SMU, and a PhD from TCU, all achieved in 25 years. Areas of expertise, medicine, dentistry, biology, agriculture, astronomy, marine biology, geology, anthropology, botany, psychology, physics, law, zoology, chess. Occupations, professor and high school science teacher, noted Boy Scout leader. He was the youngest Eagle Scout in Cleveland, and writer. Reason for taking the 3-hour tour? To write his book, Fun with Ferns. From writer David Mark, quote, "The professor of scientia, the competent voice of empirical reason, crying out among the otherwise foolish, inane, and inept," end quote. From creator Sherwood Schwartz, Bible of the Characters. Very often the professor is the one who prevents the rest of the group from taking rash actions. The others look to him and his great store of scientific knowledge, especially as it might affect their possibility of rescue. And it is to this end that the professor dedicates himself. From Joey Green's The Unofficial Gilligan's Island Handbook. While the professor may not have a poetic personality, he always seems to have the most sensible solutions. He's actually the only level-headed person on the island, a bookworm who rarely displays his emotions. In short, a shipwrecked Spock. He is clearly the castaway's guiding light and silent leader. He prefers to sit quietly in the background and let the others think that the skipper runs the island. But when it comes to judicial affairs, life-threatening matters, or possible rescue attempts, the professor unobtrusively assumes leadership. The Ss Minnow. No one can say Gilligan's Island was without hidden meanings. I was surprised to find out recently from Sherwood Schwartz that our shipwrecked vessel, the Ss Minnow, was actually named for someone. It was so christened in dubious honor of the man who, Sherwood insists, ruined television. Newton N. Minnow was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission in 1961 when he delivered a now famous speech at a broadcasters' convention lambasting television. He was speaking for the government, and he vehemently denounced our most powerful communications medium as America's vast wasteland. Gilligan should be proud that he had nothing to do with it. We hadn't yet set sail on television. The result of Minnow's speech was disastrous, Sherwood says. Until his speech, the networks were conduits, and they had no control of programming. Sponsors had more power, and the creative people who created the shows had more authority. Minnow gave the networks authority and placed the power of programming in the hands of 3 network heads who, for a long time, controlled everything coming into your living room. They eventually became the de facto producers of all primetime programs by having creative control over writing, casting, and directing. By the time Sherwood started Gilligan's Island, the networks had just begun to use the dictatorial powers Minnow had handed them. They had an Uzi in their hands, Sherwood says. I don't think Newton Minnow knows about his inadvertent inspiration. Maybe it's better that way. Otherwise, he'd be reminded of it 4 times a day in some cities. Real life on the island. When things got a little tough or tense while we were shooting Gilligan's Island, Alan, Hale, and I sometimes edged our way clear of the disagreements, and we sat and chatted. He used to say to me, "You and I are the guys who hold this thing together, you know that?" This was particularly true in the beginning, when all 7 of us were testing the waters with each other, exploring each other's eccentricities, and looking out for each other's mood swings. We'd figure out just what button to push to make each other laugh, and we pushed it when things got uptight. None of us will deny that there was a genuine human survival between the actors on this island, especially at first. Tina Louise was extremely unhappy. Jim Backus and Natalie Schaefer were not too happy with it all. It wasn't all-out warfare, but initially things did not go well with any of us. But looking at our show, you would never have known it. Television portrayed this island survival as a simple, comedic, fun, fast-moving cartoon adventure in which the worst that could happen was that Gilligan would screw up the rescue one more time. Next week, someone new would visit the island, or maybe we'd have to eat soap to save us from the dangerous levels of radiation that tainted our food. There was no downtime on this island, and that might have been the trick that hooked kids. Our show looked like no other tropical paradise on television, especially in color. And our show moved along at a fast pace with no dull stretches. I think some kids even thought it would have been wonderful to really be on that island with this crew of crazy people, always throwing parties and putting on plays and such. Some fans have told me that after school they went out and played Gilligan's Island instead of playing house or other games. So life on the island wasn't really so bad. No taxes, no pollution, no money problems, but of course no bathrooms, so the place was far from perfect. Sherwood was right. Anything other than completely incongruous fantasy would have been too gruesome to swallow. Unfortunately, real life in this televised jungle was not as ridiculously happy as it looked, especially during the first 10 weeks of filming. Sherwood Schwartz recalls that turbulent period as grim. It was a difficult time that most of us would probably like to forget. Dawn Wells, Alan Hale, and I were more even-tempered than the rest, at least at work. And don't get me wrong, however, there were days for all of us. Jim Backus could be irascible, and you just knew when to leave him alone. Natalie Schaefer was not too keen on the show from the beginning. She didn't know what she had gotten into. I don't think any of us really did. And certainly Tina Louise didn't. I have to give credit to our director, John Rich, who got us through those first 13 weeks. That unlucky number of weeks is the standard network trial period for a new show that's been placed on the air. Rich took charge and didn't take any temperament from Tina, or from any of us for that matter. He knew what he wanted, and he knew how to get it out of us for the camera. Generally, the cast came in on Monday at 10 a.m. or so for a cold reading. At that time, we took care of any special wardrobe needs, which left Bob, Alan, and me with plenty of free time. I loved that. I never changed my clothes, it seemed. I hated movies about changing clothes. Years ago, working on films while under contract to Universal Studios, I used to hope that the role would be one in which I wore the same thing forever. And with Gilligan's Island, I got it. My costume was simple. I had a rack of several pairs of khaki pants, several light blue Oxford shirts, and yellow socks. On occasion, like for a Howell cotillion, wardrobe would dress the professor up a little bit with a brown corduroy sport jacket. Those dark blue boat shoes that Bob, Alan, Jim, and I wore have now become famous in America as a style of tennis shoe. Those Kmart specials are high fashion now. If it was a dream week, though, one of those weeks in which we did an episode featuring a dream sequence, we had to be fitted for some outlandish costume that only accentuated the ridiculousness of it all. Usually, that also meant that some or all of us would have to meet specially with our makeup man, Keister Sweeney, to devise a way to reshape our appearances to accommodate the script. From Tuesday through Friday, we filmed the show, always out of sequence, the way a motion picture is shot. For instance, one morning we might begin with a scene in which the castaways rush out into the lagoon, only to realize that the dirty dog who visited our island has left us there to rot. We chased Gilligan into the water, and the final scene of the show was in the can. This was done while the sun was bright enough for shooting, and no planes or jets from the nearby Lockheed plant or the Burbank airport caused any disruption. On another afternoon, we might be on the soundstage doing the final scene of another episode. It might be a night scene with tiki torches lit all around the darkened stage. Inside the studio, daylight or outside weather conditions made no difference. When we were not filming, we usually had our studio chairs gathered together on the side of the set. Some of us had the small folding studio chairs, and some of us had the tall kind. Relaxing together, we listened to Jim and Alan tell jokes, never repeating the same one. If there was anyone I could count on to give me a good laugh at work, it was Alan or Jim. Tina rarely joined us. Mostly she went off to the side by herself or back to her dressing room, preferring not to socialize. And Bob, who was more naturally introverted, joined us when he had a chance. He was in the majority of the shots in each episode and had more lines to memorize than the rest of us, so he was constantly busy. Because the work could be fatiguing, Bob wanted to keep things moving, and he really got upset at what he felt was unnecessary delay. Occasionally, he and Tina got into an argument, and Sherwood had to leave his office and come down to the set and try to cool things off so work could continue. Unlike most half-hour sitcoms shot on videotape today, we needed 4 days to film our show. Many current sitcoms are blocked, and the script is rewritten over the course of 4 days. On the last day, it's finally shot in an afternoon or an evening in front of an audience. It took us 4 full, exhausting days to complete each episode because there were so many special effects involved. And even though the crews who pulled them off were some of the most efficient craftsmen I've ever seen, it all took an incredible amount of time. Remember, this was not simply a living room and kitchen sitcom. We had many different shots to set up in every show, back and forth from the hut to a cave to the lagoon and back to the hammocks. No 2 caves looked alike on our island. That pace kept the show moving, and it kept us moving. We might shoot from 8 a.m. until 12:30 and then break an hour for lunch. Or if we were running behind, we just snacked for a half an hour right there on the set. The TV guide shoot. There have been rumors over the years that have described Bob Denver as mean for refusing to pose for publicity pictures with the temperamental Tina Louise. It's true that Tina got quite a bit of press because of her natural beauty, which unquestionably sells in print media. But that rumor has been stretched a bit over time. Here is what actually happened. TV Guide wanted to photograph Bob and Tina, possibly attempting to add some romantic undertone to the show, which was the furthest idea from the show's premise. Bob refused to model for the photographer unless Dawn Wells was included in the shot. After all, I was working with both girls every day, and I wanted it to be fair, Bob explains. The editors at TV Guide agreed to Bob's request, except that when they shot the photos, they mysteriously instructed Dawn to remove all of her makeup, she says. Dawn did it because that's what the photographer wanted, but she thought it was strange at the time. When the cover appeared on stands a few weeks later, Dawn had been completely cropped out of the photo, except for a small portion of one pigtail that you can see at the edge of the magazine's stapled spine. Needless to say, TV Guide is not my favorite magazine, Bob says. Drive, he said. Alan and Jim were incessant golfers. These guys took this hobby so seriously, there were mornings when they'd shoot 9 holes before they came into the studio at 7 o'clock to begin filming. I'm not sure about Jim, but I know that Alan was a longtime member of the Hollywood Hackers, a golf club with a stellar membership that included nearly every big name in town. Trinket, Alan's wife, said that after he died she had no idea what to do with the more than 20 sets of golf clubs that sat in the garage. One day during a break in filming, Alan and Jim headed out to the CBS back lot behind the lagoon and decided to finally settle an argument about who could drive a ball further. Both of them shot yards away towards a ravine, and neither of them felt like strutting way over there to prove who was champ, so they just kept up their funny battle. "My ball went at least 10 yards farther than yours," Alan shouted. "Nonsense," Jim yelled back. And then the studio guard caught up with Jim and Alan. One of them had driven a ball right through some guy's windshield in a parking lot, and Jim immediately poked his club into Alan's stomach and said, "He outdrove me by a mile." Natalie saves her keister. We had a makeup man on the show who had worked at MGM for years. He specialized in women's makeup, but this guy was an expert at making anyone look better. His name was Keister Sweeney, and the reason he worked on our show is that Natalie Schaefer, who had worked with him at MGM, insisted on bringing him along, and thank God she did. Keister was one of the best makeup artists in Hollywood. and his career went back to the golden age of filmmaking. He taught many of the best makeup artists in film and television today. Keister became part of our family, and even after his retirement in the 1970s, he rejoined us for a couple of the television movies. I'm sure Natalie had a hand in that too, and Keister loved it. Our whole cast loved his perfectly accurate adjustments and alterations. Keister made me look better than anyone ever has. He showed me all kinds of tricks, and after Gilligan's, I realized he had spoiled me. My eyelids, for instance, they're the heavy type that sink a bit, and my eyebrows are light in color and fade out at the temples. Keister filled in my eyebrows and stretched my brow a bit to open my eyes up. Keister also had a way of shadowing my nose and hiding my double chin subtly, so I looked better on TV than I did anywhere else. Whenever another makeup person attended to me because of time restraints, I always went back to Keister and asked him to fix their work. Hairy coconuts and bamboo shoots. Our prop department made fantastic things. I wish I had some of them now, like those plastic coconuts we drank from, or my makeshift laboratory setup, constructed of intricate pieces of bamboo and vines with dripping island serum and little Bunsen burners and test gourds. We used to cheer the prop guys when we came on the set and saw how they had accomplished the script's needs. One time a story called for a primitive little car for Gilligan to chauffeur the Howells around in. The crew just couldn't wait for us to try it out. They were like the kid on Christmas who can't wait for his dad to finish assembling his bike. Of course, the prop men and the special effects guys were efficient and tested every contraption and explosion well ahead of the shooting day. At any given time, Sherwood had more than 10 scripts stacked on his desk just waiting to be produced, so the crews had time to perfect their inventions. They rarely screwed up for the camera, and usually everyone on the set applauded them. These guys loved their work because it brought out their creativity. Generally speaking, in a studio prop shop, you're not making a lot of things. You're ordering stuff from large prop houses. But for Gilligan's, they had a distinct assignment. They had to solve a problem and do it with bamboo, gourds, strands of rope, and coconut shells. It got to the point where the whole Gilligan's company looked forward to seeing how these ingenious prop guys would build Mr. Howell's pool table or a bicycle-driven washing machine for Mary Ann. They would usually explain to me how the contraptions worked because I had to explain it to the castaways. The Professor's Island Inventions. Okay, so I couldn't build a boat. The professor improvised with gadgets and concocted some pretty wild antidotes. But I must refute something. Despite what you hear, the professor never built a nuclear reactor or a satellite communication system out of clamshells. Oh, here's an inventory of what he did build. A bamboo lie detector hooked up to the ship's horn and the radio's batteries. Shark repellent. A coconut shell battery recharger. A bamboo telescope. Jetpack fuel. A strychnine serum that temporarily paralyzes Gilligan. A Keptobora berry extract to remedy Gilligan's double vision. A helium balloon. Rubber raincoats sewn together and sealed with tree sap. A bamboo xylophone. Soap made from plant fats. A Geiger counter. Lead radiation suits and makeup. Protection from a meteor's cosmic rays. A pedal-powered bamboo sewing machine. A washing machine, water pump, and telegraph, all pedal-powered. An assortment of hair tonics, antiseptics, poisons, spider cider to kill off a gargantuan black morning spider, and even a batch of nitroglycerin. And Mr. Howell's roulette wheel and pool table. Jungle blunders. For some strange reason, fans have a fixation about accidents that occurred while we were filming the show. There's something about physical harm and catastrophic misfortunes that stimulates the imagination and heightens curiosity. It's human nature, I guess, like slowing down to gawk at a twisted wreck on a highway. Truthfully, none of us ever really suffered any serious injuries while filming Gilligan's. Every one of us was in every single episode, and luckily, not one of us missed a show. The mishaps, which emerged from simple slapstick gone awry, sometimes meant a whirl to the emergency room or a rewrite of the script. And other times there were close calls. For instance, fate was on Bob Denver's side the time Gilligan and the skipper switched hammocks for a scene. I don't recall why Skipper was in the top hammock, but it was part of the script. In rehearsal one day, Alan Hale, who was every pound as solid as he looked, made a free fall from the top hammock right down onto a mat on the sandy floor. You could hear him yell, "Nope!" from across the stage. All of a sudden, Bob looked out from the bottom hammock, white as a ghost. He stared and took a breath. He had been lying there quietly preparing to drop out of his hammock first, and if Alan had plummeted into him, a few of Bob's skinny bones would have been snapped. Now you can guess the rest. The professor would have had to make a cast for Gilligan to wear conspicuously for many episodes. In one show, if you look closely, you can see a bandage on Alan's right ear. In this episode, we put on a play, and Ginger and Mrs. Howell argued about who would play Cleopatra. Near the end, Gilligan carried a bamboo ladder on stage, and the skipper, dressed in undershorts and a toga, walked right through it, breaking the rungs. The prop men demonstrated the gag for Alan, and the thin bamboo they had made for the rungs snapped as easily as pretzels. Alan tried the gag once, and when the soft bamboo broke, it exposed a sharp edge that sliced into his ear. Alan's dedication to the show was undaunted. He would do just about anything to assist in itself. This is a guy who took a fall from a palm tree and broke his wrist, but told no one. There were 2 more episodes to film that season before we scattered on hiatus, and Alan didn't want to disturb the course of events. He never took a day off and never complained. At a wrap party celebrating the close of the first season, Sherwood Schwartz took Alan aside and asked him why his wrist looked painfully swollen. Alan told him about the accident. None of us knew till then. When Alan finally went to his doctor, he was fitted with a cast from wrist to elbow. The only time I was injured in the series was during a jungle scene. I was standing on a green apple box that was elevated for some reason I don't remember. When I stepped off it, something slippery was under me, and I lost my balance and fell. And when I went down, I wrenched my right knee, and I could barely walk. I was taken to the small medic station on the lot, and then had to go on to an orthopedic doctor in Sherman Oaks where I was x-rayed. The doctor injected cortisone by jamming a long hypodermic needle into the inside of my knee, and I almost passed out when it penetrated. I had all kinds of shots in the Army, and they didn't bother me, but this one knocked me nearly senseless. The doctor gave me crutches and wanted me to return in a few days for the second of several shots. I told him, "You'll never see me again," handed back the crutches, hobbled out of his office, and was driven back to the studio. I went back to work that day, but not before a studio medic had me sign a waiver. My knee healed on its own, and I'm glad to report that that was the only island injury I suffered. Sex and the Island Girls. Sherwood Schwartz was the policeman on our set. This was by choice, not appointment, because he genuinely and unceasingly cared for his show. It was his baby, and he wanted to keep conflicts to a minimum and a happy cast. On our set, if any problems arose either with the script or with a person, we were invited to discuss it with Sherwood and attempt to resolve the matter peacefully, hopefully to everyone's satisfaction. And there were times when Sherwood had to be called away from his office to come down on the set and settle something. It was evident to everyone that Sherwood tried to be fair with all of us, no matter what the request was. Sherwood replayed some wonderful memories of his own survival on the island in his 1988 book, Inside Gilligan's Island, From Creation to Syndication, which was originally titled Having It All, How One Tiny Island Brought Me Fame, Fortune, and Migraines. One of his funnier stories had to do with the problem of cleavage. Sherwood says, "Tina played most of her scenes in her light beige V-neck gown, and somehow between rehearsals and the time the camera rolled for actual takes, the V was mysteriously slipping down to reveal more cleavage. From time to time, I would get a phone call from the director of that episode asking me to come to the stage and make a decision. This was among my pleasanter duties as the executive producer, to gaze at Tina's bosom and decide whether or not there was too much cleavage." Sherwood remembers being called to the set again on another day for the same problem. I said to her, "Tina, we'll have to do that scene over. You've got to stop yanking down the front of that dress." Tina denied any such action, so I told her, "Okay, then leave it that way. When you see this scene on the air, you'll find you're a voiceover. The camera will be on the other people, and we'll just hear Ginger's voice." Tina blurted out, "I don't know what's wrong. I'm not showing anything that everybody hasn't seen a million times before on every TV show." Nevertheless, says Sherwood, she hiked her dress up a few inches so that some of the cleavage disappeared. Tina had a funny sense of humor. Sometimes she loved to be shocking, yet she'd retain that feminine side that made the character of Ginger so seductive. There was a scene inside a hut in which Tina put on a show for the Howells, singing a breathy, sexy rendition of the French song Alouette. She stood behind a bamboo microphone with a round rock attached to the top. For several takes, Tina closed her eyes, put her lips right next to it, sang to it, and stroked it. And it was pretty damn suggestive. And finally, the director had to yell, "Cut. Now come on, Tina, we can't use that, and you know it." Sherwood also had to police the set when Dawn wore her real short shorts. Because of the censor's intermittent navel rule, says Sherwood, Dawn's belly button had to be hidden most of the time by her hip huggers. Dawn couldn't believe it, but what could she do? When she could, she got away with it. She did it because she knew it wasn't a national crisis if the world noticed her navel every once in a while. Sherwood said he returned home one night after work, just exhausted from traffic duty on the set, and his wife Mildred asked him how his day had gone, and he told her, "It was rough, dear. Between Tina's breasts and Dawn's belly button, I didn't have a moment's peace." Dream Hut. Because sleeping and dreaming were the sole nocturnal activities on Gilligan's Island, the writers loved to conjure up dream sequences as much as we enjoyed acting out the ridiculous hallucinations. And who says you don't dream in color? We did, beginning in our second season. In fact, we couldn't wait for the second season when we heard that we'd be filming in color. Our show was perfect for color television, with those pink island sunsets and the tropical setting. The dream sequences were pertinent. They widened the scope for more insanity. Every one of us enjoyed doing accents, putting on wild costumes, getting made up and stretching our imaginations. On any given day on our set, you might find Alan Hale in drag, or see a balding Tina Louise, or Bob Denver in ashen makeup and a black cape as Dracula. These fantasies eventually became the favorite episodes for most of us. Jim Backus said his favorite role was the one in which he played an old crotchety prospector who struck gold in the mountains. The western set we used to film that episode was the dusty Dodge City street from Gunsmoke. Jim ad-libbed a lot in those scenes and injected quite a bit of Mr. Magoo into that old prospector. I suspect that's why it was his favorite. Natalie Schaefer was quick to say her favorite episode involved Lovey's dream of the Cinderella story, in which she played the tortured, ugly stepsister who magically gets an invitation to the ball by her clumsy fairy godfather, Gilligan. Dawn Wells says she really enjoyed the Eliza Doolittle character she played in the dream sequence in which Gilligan turned from Jekyll to Hyde at the mere mention of food. Well, I'm not sure I'd pick this as my favorite, but I like the one in which I did my Cary Grant imitation. After I filmed that, Sherwood pulled me aside and with a straight face said, "Russ, that was the best Rex Harrison I've ever seen." He still gives me trouble about that one. There were a couple of times I had to get special makeup applied to look like a shriveled-up, hunched-over 90-year-old man. I had a great line at the end of the Jack and the Beanstalk dream episode in which Gilligan rescued the goose that laid the golden oranges and saved 2 old prisoners from a dungeon in the giant's castle. Tina and I were made to look pretty damn filthy and ugly, since we had been trapped in there for decades by the ominous giant. As a reward, Gilligan was kissed by the old hag, who suddenly became a beautiful princess wearing a sparkling tiara. I convinced sweet little Mary Ann that she had to kiss me so that I could be transformed too. She hated the idea of it, but she gave in, and I grabbed her in my arms like a lecher and dipped her while I kissed her, only I didn't turn into a prince. Disgusted, she says, "Oh, you're not a prince." "No, I'm not, am I?" I said, cackling. "Well, don't believe everything you hear, girlie." That Beanstalk episode stuck in Alan Hale's mind because more than one fan told him that he was downright frightening as the evil giant. Island Beasts. It seemed that in every other episode we had some crazed little monkey on the set moving around, crapping on the soundstage, or getting into mischief. I recall clearly one organ grinder monkey that was a strange-looking cuss. He was a senior citizen monkey with no teeth, and he wanted to bite me continually. If I was sitting in my chair, he'd sidle up and start to gnaw on my arm and my hands, only he was gumming me. He found me pretty tasty. One day I pushed him away, but he kept jumping back at me. He drove me crazy. Vito Scotti, a wonderfully versatile character actor who visited our island several times, worked closely with that dysfunctional monkey. As Boris Balankoff, an insane scientist, he put a spell on the castaways and ruled them by walkie-talkie. Vito also worked with a nervous twitching parrot that left droppings on his shoulder every time there was a sudden noise or movement. And with the birds, we had cats, big cats. There was one morning at the studio that I can still see clearly. I was sitting at Keister Sweeney's makeup table, which was set up behind the cyc, our backdrop with a sky painted on it, surrounding our set. Keister was putting my makeup on, and I was sitting facing the mirror when I looked up and saw a sleek Bengal tiger walking toward us. All I could do was calmly say, "Keister, don't move a muscle. Don't turn around. There's a live tiger about 40 feet away heading right toward us. Don't act like you even see it." "There's no trainer? Just a tiger." I clenched the armrest and stopped breathing for a moment while the tiger wandered around, and I tried not to make eye contact with it through the mirror. His trainer started calling him from the other side of the stage. "Harry! Here, Harry! Here, Harry!" And it seemed like an eternity until they found Harry and gently leashed him up. I've never felt a frozen fright like that. We had a lion on another show, and I wasn't apprehensive about it because it almost looked as if it wanted to be petted. To me, a lion is a lion, but a tiger is a tiger. In that episode, Gilligan made friends with a full-grown lion. I remember a scene in which the lion wandered out of the Howell's hut and Mrs. Howell ran away from it into the jungle. Now, Natalie Schaefer was adept at pulling off any type of crazy scheme the scripts called for and enjoyed doing so. This is something she never got working on the stage. But lion trainer or no lion trainer, Natalie made sure she was not going to be around that animal. She was petrified of the notion. In the read-through, Natalie had no qualms about informing Sherwood point-blank that a stand-in would be necessary for her scene because she refused to go near the beast. I'll be damned. Vox populi. It means the people's voice. That Latin phrase became most important in the survival for us castaways on television. It's been proven over the years that our show is a bit of an anomaly. The people's voice said they loved us castaways, while the critics almost unanimously wanted to sink our island. They detested us. We've been considered the dregs of television, and it has never set well with any of us. As a cast, we were devastated at what the critics wrote and said about us. We couldn't figure it out because we had high ratings, reached the top 10, and some weeks reached number 3. A few weeks after we premiered in the fall of 1964, some 350 TV critics and columnists voted in a national poll and named our show the worst new show of the season. Not since the Beverly Hillbillies was introduced 2 years earlier did critics pounce on a show and devour it so recklessly. It became fashionable to knock us. Jim Backus used to say they weren't reviews, they were character assassinations. Sherwood Schwartz saved some of the damn things, and I'm not really sure why, but let me give you a taste of the venom. It is impossible that a more inept, moronic, or humorless show has ever appeared on the home tube. Rick Dubrow, UPI. Without a doubt, Gilligan's Island is the stinkeroo of all time. I have a feeling the cannibals will get them soon. Fred Storm, the San Francisco News Call Bulletin. It is difficult for me to believe that Gilligan's Island was written, directed, and filmed by adults. It marks a new low in the network's estimate of public intelligence. Terence O'Flaherty, San Francisco Chronicle. The nonsense that transpires on Gilligan's Island may stir up some laughter if you're a child, or unsober, or slightly weak in the head. Donald Freeman, San Diego Union. Sherwood was angry about the lack of understanding of what the show was attempting. We weren't curing cancer here. It wasn't Hamlet. In other words, a little nonsense in everybody's life is not so bad. I'm sure the critics who panned us from the beginning would have preferred to witness our show's burial at sea, but instead, we've stayed afloat on the airwaves all these years while hundreds of situation comedies have sunk beneath the waves. You see, our show merely filled the spot it was supposed to. We didn't pretend to be sophisticated. It was silly. It was kind of dumb, but it was funny. In fact, Gilligan's Island remains an example of well-constructed humor, and many times and in many ways, it has been recognized as such. Finally, a little praise. Syndicated columnist Tom Shales recently provided some positive commentary about our show. After all the years of being accustomed to critical disdain, I nearly dropped my test tubes when I read this. 20 years from now, kids will probably still be laughing at Gilligan's Island long after the tropical, provocative sitcoms, which critics are always championing, have been forgotten. It was never smutty or cynical or pretentious. Nobody on Gilligan's Island ever needed a condom or went through menopause or puberty. Nobody made politically correct pronouncements on the issues of the day. No wonder that island seems such a refuge now. It's not that sitcoms and other entertainment shows should be dopey and frivolous, but in recent years escapism has become a devalued commodity in the TV marketplace. There's something to be said for a show on which nothing of serious social import ever happens. In fact, there's serious social import in that. After all the abuse heaped on the series, it's time somebody dared say that Denver and Hale did an awfully adroit job of following in slapstick footsteps left by Laurel and Hardy. Hale's slow burns and exasperated looks into the lens were obvious and loving homage to the immortal Oliver Hardy, and Denver made a droll fool. Sojourners. If it weren't for the 20-some passers-by who stopped at the island, the show might have passed for believable. And we had an interesting blend of celebrities visit the island, like Phil Silvers, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Strother Martin, and Don Rickles. Outside of some native girls and a ginger look-alike, the only woman to stumble upon us was Erica Tiffany Smith, played by Zsa Zsa Gabor. That was an episode in which the professor was tapped for the spotlight. For me, that was a big show, because Zsa Zsa's character was a wealthy social butterfly who had her eye on the professor. I had to try to learn romance from Ginger in a very short period of time. I remember the episode well because it was the first of several times the script called for me to kiss Tina. The first visitor to our show was Hans Conried, who played Wrong-Way Feldman, a grubby old airplane pilot who has spurned civilization. Hans was a lovely man, and he enacted Wrong Way again in a subsequent episode. He and I shared the same agent, and what I remember most about him was that he was a very well-read, cultured gentleman and a wonderful actor. A show like ours, by logic anyway, would be defeating its own premise if people continually found the island. We should have had no visitors, but instead the castaways were host to a privileged handful of talented character actors who visited the island. Some of them have gone on to wonderful things. You may remember the episode that Kurt Russell did. He was a jungle boy whom Gilligan discovers on the island. This was when Kurt was a young fellow, in his Disney days. His father, Bing Russell, was a good friend of mine, and Bing escorted young Kurt to the set each day. Kurt has fond memories of the show, I know, and I must say, he grew up to be one hell of a good actor, just like his old man. Phil Silvers was involved with Gilligan's Island from the beginning, because his company was in a joint venture with Sherwood Schwartz, CBS, and United Artists in producing the show. Silvers came on our show once, playing a hilarious, temperamental, blowhard Hollywood producer named Harold Hecuba. In an effort to urge Hecuba to get them rescued, the castaways produced their own stage version of Hamlet, with the most memorable music selections from the opera Carmen. Hecuba eventually fled the island and forgot about the castaways, of course. But because of that episode, many kids recognize the famous habanera from Carmen without realizing it is opera. To them, it's just a catchy tune. One well-known actress worked on our show but was never seen. Ida Lupino was a respected actress with many film roles to her credit by the time she directed us in a handful of episodes. I admired her work in films in the 1940s and 50s. In 1950, she directed the first of several films, but even in the 60s, there were very few female directors in television. We all respected the long career of this strong-willed woman. She was damn good. Vito Scotti can claim the distinction of visiting the island more than any other actor. He got his unusual parts because, by experimenting with wild makeup and costumes, he could transform himself. In fact, most people rarely put it together that the same guy who played the Japanese soldier in 2 episodes was the same person who played Boris Balinkoff. Vito told me his film idol was Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. When Vito became the Japanese soldier who didn't know the war had ended, he played it high, which means as an obvious parody. Vito wore glasses that had lenses like the bottom of Coke bottles, and he could barely see out of them. His depiction was hilariously stereotypical. The rule was, if you make Jim Backus laugh, you are funny, and Vito had us all laughing out loud. Recently, Vito says there was a story on the CBS Evening News about the anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The story also stated that Japanese actors in the Screen Actors Guild are very sensitive about non-Japanese actors portraying Japanese. Right then, when Dan Rather was talking about it, they showed a clip of me from Gilligan's Island as the Japanese soldier, Vito says. Back then, Vito could get away with undertaking such roles. Today, it's unacceptable, and justifiably so. But Vito has a few hundred other faces he can put on, so he'll be just fine. Vito recalls a potentially dangerous moment on Gilligan's Island that he can laugh at now. Playing Balinkoff in a final scene, he warned the castaways that he'd be back. Then he was supposed to step into a small motorboat and flee the lagoon. I got into this motorboat and I pulled on the cord to start the motor, Vito says. I let the cord go, and it caught the rope that held my mantle, which was like an exquisite black cape. The cord knotted up and pulled my face close to the motor. I lost control of the boat, and it's running wild all over the lagoon and crossing and coming back again, and I was trying to holler for help because I couldn't stop the damn thing. The motor had been running long enough by then that it was getting hot next to my face, Vito continues. And finally, the boat ran aground and sort of climbed into the trees and bushes. The cameramen were laughing because they thought it was a gag, and I told them, hell no, that wasn't a gag. I almost got hurt, and they wanted me to do it again. Unfortunately, they didn't have the camera rolling when I did it the first time. I'm sure it would have looked funny on film. The Island's End. We never got a chance to say goodbye. When the 7 of us finished filming our 98th episode at the end of the 3rd season, the whole production company took a break, fully expecting to spend another year on the island when we returned. Sherwood Schwartz had received an official renewal notice from the network and personally called each of us to deliver the great news that we'd been picked up for a 4th season. We all celebrated in our own personal way because another year of work meant another year of financial stability in a business that's almost never stable. As actors, parents, and spouses trying to make a living, we counted on that 4th season. And then things got turned upside down in what seemed like a day. This is what happened. CBS decided to cancel its old warhorse, Gunsmoke. The network affiliates became outraged, as did many CBS bigwigs, which forced the network programmers to quickly reinstate the show. That meant sacrificing a half-hour show to make room on the schedule. Despite healthy ratings, the network bid us aloha. Sherwood was mortified when he got the call and realized he would have to call all of us immediately and tell us we were finished. It was embarrassing and crushing for everyone, but for Sherwood, I think it was a bit more humiliating. He was heartbroken, and he was very apologetic on the telephone. Of course, it wasn't his fault, so we never returned to the studio as a group. We went our separate ways without a party or a kiss or a hug. The huts were quickly dismantled, the jungle was torn down, and the sound stage was swept clean of sand so the space could be used for some other production. It was 21 years until we all set foot in the same room together. Even the man who put us on the island was there that evening in May of 1988, when we all appeared on the Fox network's The Late Show with host Ross Schaefer. The group even included Jim Backus, who was quite ill at the time, and Tina Louise, who had always fought to sever her connection with the show. This hour-long tribute to Gilligan's Island was our only complete reunion, and we all felt positive about it, and I thought we all looked pretty good, too. The first film resurrection was in 1974, when ABC placed the New Adventures of Gilligan on its Saturday morning lineup. The animated version of our castaway characters was produced in a joint venture between Filmation Associates and Sherwood Schwartz. Sherwood says he settled on the animated series because all his attempts to sell the networks on a TV movie that would rescue the castaways had failed. Sherwood attempted to round up all of the original cast to resuscitate our characters, but that was impossible. Dawn Wells was living in Nashville and touring in a stage production, and Tina was the only one who decided to divorce herself from Gilligan's Island, relinquishing custody of Ginger to Sherwood Schwartz. Even so, the cartoon Ginger had mysteriously bleached her hair white. Sherwood explains, "We had to change her appearance. We were afraid Tina might try to sue us for using her image, so we deliberately made Ginger look different." Providing my own unaltered voice for a character by simply reading the script into a microphone was the easiest work I had ever done in this business. 2 seasons of the cartoon show were produced, and to me it was like found money. As actors, we thought the work was casual and fun. Natalie Schaefer used to say she loved doing voiceover work because you don't have to hold your stomach in. Jim Backus was an old pro at this since he had been in front of the mic many times supplying the voice for his famous bumbling Mr. Magoo. It was rare for all of us to be in the same studio at the same time to record our voices. Bob Denver sometimes recorded his lines separately, often in another city where he was working. So that left Alan, Natalie, Jim, and me in the studio to record maybe 4 scripts in an afternoon. Mary Ann's voice was provided by actress Jane Webb, and Ginger's by actress Jane Edwards. In the end, I think we made the transition from live characters to cartoon characters effortlessly. After all, in the original series, our colorful costumes, bamboo gadgets, and tropical scenery already looked cartoon-like. For that matter, we looked cartoonish. Frankly, none of us could believe that the show was being revived, because none of us had much faith in the island to begin with. Then we made these cartoons and started to notice that the old island was really hanging in there for some strange reason. The rescue. Sherwood Schwartz called this a rescue. I called it an escape. After 15 years, somehow, some way, the 7 stranded castaways who needed absolutely no introduction to television audiences were finally contriving a means of reaching civilization. We were finally getting off that fictional island. It seemed as if it would never happen. You see, ever since we had gotten canceled, Sherwood had savored the idea of someday going back and capping the open lid he had left the viewers. 10 years went by, 15 years approached, and finally he interested some NBC network executives in rescuing the castaways. Even though NBC was hesitant at first, Sherwood was so sure of the idea that he ended up financing the film himself. It was a gamble in many ways, the most obvious being that these waters were untested. Up until that time, there had been no such thing as reunion movies on television. Sherwood guaranteed only 6 of the 7 original cast members because he knew Tina would be unobtainable. When I got his phone call, naturally I was interested in playing the professor again, but I wanted a little time to think about it. The original series had done some damage to my career, so I wondered if this would deepen the wound. Would it be good for my career? Would it matter at all? I had a lot of thoughts about whether to do the TV movie, and one of them was that Sherwood was going to do the movie no matter who was in it. So I talked it over with my wife, and we both came to the same conclusion. All right, do it. Have a good time, reminisce with old friends, and make a buck. Tina was offered the role of Ginger in Rescue from Gilligan's Island, and to Sherwood's surprise, she considered it, and reconsidered it, many times. Finally, within a matter of days before the movie was to begin filming, Tina demanded what Sherwood referred to as a Godfather sum, which was about 1/10 of the movie's budget. Sherwood decided to recast the role and hired a tall redhead named Judith Baldwin to play Ginger. The first time the cast got together was at a meeting on the CBS lot in a conference room. We hugged and caught up with each other's lives, and we marveled how good everybody looked. It was going to be great to work together again. The scripts were handed out, and we sat around a big conference table and had our initial read-through of The Rescue. The project started out as a 2-hour movie. NBC foresaw high ratings, so the executives got greedy and decided to break it into 2 one-hour specials to air on succeeding Saturday nights. We filmed it on the old Lagoon at CBS, which still held water, believe it or not. Some scenes that took place in the ocean were filmed at Paramount Studios in the huge outdoor tank, with the sky painted on a huge wall behind it. Somebody suggested that the story involved the skipper and Gilligan hunting down the individuals who visited the island and terrorizing them for making the castaways spend 15 more years there. It was Mother Nature who had hit the island with a violent hurricane that put the rescue into motion. Because of a little metallic disc that Gilligan found, the professor was able to activate a barometer and predict the catastrophic weather. The castaways lashed their huts together in an effort to stay afloat, and when the storm hit, the new community hut, with a patch of land beneath it, were washed out to sea. Utilizing the Howell's vast wardrobe, the castaways constructed a sail, and Gilligan bumbled once again when he started a fire to broil some fish. The hut caught fire, causing billows of smoke, which attracted a Coast Guard helicopter, and our plight had ended. The rescue scene was shot in Marina del Rey, California, with sailboats and fireboats and a Coast Guard cutter surrounding the floating hut being towed into the harbor. It was an incredible sight. Coast Guard sirens were blasting, people were waving, there were bands playing, and hundreds of extras all around the pier cheering us. Many of them were tourists who wanted to witness the rescue. When we ambled up the gangplank to meet civilization, finally, tears were streaming from many people's eyes, including ours. At that moment, the show became a reality for us as well as the viewers. It was as if we had really been saved. In the script, the castaways finally decided to part ways and return to a faster-paced society. As the crowd scattered, the castaways were left alone to say their goodbyes, and that scene meant a lot to us. We finally got a chance to hug and say goodbye, officially, on film. Meanwhile, the professor found scientific innovations mind-boggling, and Ginger realized that show business had lost its innocence. The skipper and Gilligan tried to purchase a new charter boat, but to no avail because the skipper was considered at fault for the original shipwreck. Mary Ann almost married her old boyfriend back home on the Kansas farm, and the Howells found out that their old associates didn't think much of their island family. The second hour of the film aired the following Saturday night. It involved a subplot about two inept Soviet spies attempting to retrieve Gilligan's good luck charm, which happened to be a valuable plutonium disc. A year passed, and on the anniversary of their rescue, the former castaways got together for a cruise on the skipper's new vessel, the Ss Minnow II. Once again, a storm hit when they were out on the water, and they were shipwrecked on the same island again. And this reunion really did make it seem as if all of us had just left for the weekend and returned on Monday to resume the series. We fell back into it quickly. Our rescue was hyped in the press pretty heavily, but we never knew what kind of ratings tidal wave we were about to create. NBC, on the other hand, knew it had something powerful and kicked off its new season with the premiere of Rescue from Gilligan's Island on October 14, 1978. That night, our movie got a whopping 52 share and a Nielsen rating of 30.2. Those were phenomenal numbers. Today, Rescue from Gilligan's Island remains one of the highest-rated TV movies of all time. In the years after we all parted ways in 1967, we gathered together mostly for work on a charity cause or a talk show or a guest appearance as a castaway on another sitcom. The TV reunion I got charged up for was our family feud battle against the casts of Hawaiian Eye, Batman, and Lost in Space. We won and raised $20,000 for the motion picture home. Most of us have put on our old costumes or a facsimile of it to appear in all types of show and charity functions. Tina Louise surprised us when she joined us at a dedication ceremony of the Gilligan's Island waiting room at Los Angeles Children's Hospital. You may remember that Bob and Alan sat in a box together on Hollywood Squares, and that Natalie and Jim became Mr. and Mrs. Howell for an Orville Redenbacher popcorn ad in the early 1980s. Other shows that have paid homage to Gilligan's Island include The Wild Wild West, Alf, Baywatch, The New Gidget, The New Monkeys, It's Gary Shandling's Show, The Bob Newhart Show, and The Simpsons. I think the last public appearance Jim and Natalie did together was a segment of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. How appropriate. More TV movies and reunions. Following Rescue from Gilligan's Island, the network knew it had a good thing. Our record-breaking success in Rescue prompted two more TV movies, The Castaways on Gilligan's Island and The Harlem Globetrotters on Gilligan's Island. All right, so these weren't the best TV movies in the world, but the ratings they received were respectable, and I'm positive that Sherwood was gearing up to put us on another uncharted island in weekly installments if a network would agree. Audiences kept tuning in to see what we looked like after all those years. But things were nearing the end. I could see it. In Castaways, a 90-minute movie, we were stranded on the same island again. Gilligan stumbled upon two disabled World War II fighter planes and a machine shop in a Quonset hut that we had somehow overlooked all the years we were on the island. I combined parts from the planes and flew us off the island, only the plane cracked up and we had to make an emergency landing back on the island. The Coast Guard spotted us, and this time we were instantly rescued. Mr. Howell transformed the island into a resort paradise, and imagine he allowed all of us to be partners in the venture. Of course, Gilligan and the skipper still slept in hammocks that hung in a hut, and the rest of us were dressed in the same clothes we had worn for 15 years, prowling the new resort like costumed mascots at a theme park. The movie aired in March 1979. The ratings were modest. None of us really expected to put on those costumes again, but Sherwood resuscitated the crew and passengers of the Ss Minnow one more time. Sherwood, along with NBC, played around with the idea of having the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders come to the island resort, and those plans were thwarted by scheduling problems for the Texas Beauties. Instead, the Harlem Globetrotters crash-landed near the island and became the guests in this 1981 TV movie. This was really the end of the end, and most of us from the original cast knew it. At some point between Castaways and Globetrotters, Alan had suffered a blood clot in his leg that caused complications throughout his body. He was ordered by his doctors to drop some weight and to quit smoking. He was noticeably thinner in Globetrotters, and so was Jim Backus, who was so ill that he only came in at the end of the film for a quick cameo appearance. Originally, Jim's doctor advised him not to participate at all, so Jim wasn't scheduled to be in the film, but his wife, Henny, called Sherwood and said that she thought he might be able to do something brief. In one day, Sherwood rewrote the final scene to accommodate Thurston Hall III, and it was just like old times. When his scene was completed, Henny led Jim arm in arm to the soundstage doors. They walked very slowly. The whole crew and all of us in the cast applauded Jim because we knew this might be the last time this trooper would be joining us. And I looked over at Natalie. She had just given Jim a big kiss and a hug, and tears welled in her eyes as she waved goodbye to her Thurston. Jim turned and blew us a kiss. Skipper's hat. If the Smithsonian Institution could display just two items to represent Gilligan's Island, they would be Gilligan's flimsy white hat and Skipper's black cap. Bob says he saved only 2 of the dozens of stretched-out hats he went through over the years, but Alan's original black cap, the one that went through almost every episode in the series, was uniquely presented to Sherwood Schwartz by its grateful owner. Alan spoke of the gesture a few years ago. Having great admiration for Sherwood, he said, I took the hat and had it bronzed, like baby shoes, if you will, and I think he was very taken by it. It's in his library now, and I thank him for accepting it. What started out as an ornamental piece of Alan's costume and a prop to Pop Gilligan became a natural part of his daily appearance long after the series ended. Every few years or so, Alan would make a trip down to a marine supply store in Long Beach and load up on a supply of skipper caps, and he never seemed to go anywhere without one atop his dome. He wore it to the store, he played golf with it on, and whenever one of his caps had seen too many days, Alan gave it to a fan. It got to be such a part of him that Alan looked odd without it. The caps he wore later on were not always black. Some were white with gold trim, and on a few of them there was a small green gemstone in the center of the gold anchor insignia embroidered on the front. Whenever Alan played in celebrity golf tournaments around the country, he proudly placed his cap in the charity auction. Top price fetched for an authentic skipper's cap, $750. That's how aware people are of Gilligan's Island and the skipper, Alan said. And for you trivia mavens, Alan's hat size was 7 3/8. Reef Madness. If ever a group of actors was typecast, it was us, every single one of us. It was like the curse of Kona. From the time I started making a living as an actor in 1950 until Gilligan's in 1964, I had basically played heavies. You know, the bad guy. I had some straight roles, but mostly I was known as a character heavy to the casting people. Then Gilligan's came along, and after the show was over, I couldn't get a job playing heavies. Producers would say, "What are you talking about? Are you kidding?" The turnover in Hollywood is amazing, and especially today, many people have only been exposed to me as the kind, sensible, reasonable professor. It took quite a while before people would accept me as anything but that type. It was a very difficult period in my life and in my career. I was auditioning for a feature film after Gilligan's, and some 24-year-old casting associate said, "Tell me a little about your career." Frustration stole my patience. All I could blurt out was, "Where the hell have you been?" "I'm sorry," I told the kid. I've been working here for 25 years. Don't you know anything about me?" He gave an excuse that he was from the East Coast, and I said, your job as a casting person is to have some idea as to whom you're talking to. I'm not new. You are. Natalie Schaefer told me that had happened to her, but she had a remedy. If the casting director sat back and said to her, tell me a little about yourself, she'd say, you first. Gilligan's Island hasn't left the television airwaves since it began. Immediately following our cancellation from primetime in 1967, we were stripped into daytime television in many markets around the country and abroad. This is called syndication, which means the reruns are rerun and rerun again and again in different cities and on national cable networks, so that when we say Gilligan's Island has never left television, it's the truth. Sherwood Schwartz says Gilligan's Island has been repeated more often in more places than any other television show in history. Fans assume that we all became rich as the Howells from this show, but it boils down to this. 2 years after the show went into syndication, each of us was paid in full, and from then on we've made nothing. Zip, zero, nothing. When the show was canceled, the cast was offered either the usual decreasing residuals or an immediate buyout of our contracts, which added up to 50 cents on the dollar, which we promptly rejected. One thing you realize in this business, nobody gives you anything. You get paid a certain sum because in the end, someone else is making triple, 5, or 10 times that. Haha, if only I had $1 for every time the show is aired somewhere. Stuck on Gilligan's Island. We've always had the greatest fans. Ask any one of us castaways. Fans have always felt free about coming up to us at any time, anywhere, but always with a smile. We've even attracted sophisticated fans like Walter Cronkite, who was a good friend of Alan Hale's. Gregory Peck once told Jim Backus that he never missed Gilligan's Island. Betty Davis used to love having lunch with us on the set. Our show's appeal knows no parameters, it seems. Bob Denver told me one time there was a Hawaiian family, 2 parents and a few children, who stood outside his home when he had a little place on the island of Kauai. The family sang the theme song at 6 a.m. until Bob finally poked his head out the window. Bob really does enjoy sailing, so he dreads it when he's got to rent a boat. Believe me, he's heard them all, and it's always the same. 3-hour tour, huh? We'll never see this boat again, will we? And kids really clung to Alan, as they cling to the Santa Claus myth. Sherwood Schwartz remembers a time when he and Alan visited a room at a children's hospital where a little boy had just had a kidney removed. The boy was beginning to stir from the anesthesia, and Alan was standing at the foot of the bed when he came out of it. And Sherwood recalls, when his vision started to clear, he looked at Alan in disbelief. His eyes suddenly opened wide, and his face filled with wonder. In a voice that wasn't much more than a whisper, he said, "Skipper?" Alan, as usual, knew exactly the right thing to say. "That's right, son. The skipper is here with you. Everything's going to be fine now." A smile appeared on the boy's face. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. That's one of the satisfying aspects of being a celebrity. Unanimously, we, the cast of Gilligan's, have found it astonishing that the program we finished 30 years ago still has an impact on children. And those children have carried their affection for the show well into parenthood and trust Gilligan's Island with their own children as if we were family. But adult fans can sometimes be more awkward and embarrassing than their children. My first wife, Kay, and I were in awe when we visited Westminster Abbey in 1979. While we were in the cathedral, a group of people, maybe 20 of them, surrounded my wife and myself. Here we were in the center of this legendary house of worship, and people were pushing pens and paper in front of my face, asking if they could have my autograph. Every one of them had a camera. Some of them were shooting home movies of me. I was embarrassed and I was annoyed because I didn't want to do this kind of thing in what I considered a hallowed place. I kept asking the people, please, not in Westminster Abbey, this is a church. I told them I would be happy to do all of that outside, and I still had to plead with them to let my wife and myself enjoy the Abbey in privacy. And I have to add that these were mostly American tourists, not British. Well, these things happen. Really, though, fans are fun. When I was doing a guest spot on a sitcom a few years ago, one of the episode's writers, a young guy in his early 20s, came up to me and asked if I'd sign an autograph. But he asked for something specific. He wanted me to write, "Thanks for saving my life in Nam." That made me laugh, so I wrote it. At a science fiction convention in Baltimore, I made a personal appearance to discuss some of the films I made in the 50s, and I was amazed when nearly 90% of the questions that fans asked were about Gilligan's Island. When I sat down to autograph photographs and such, a stream of fans had gone to a nearby grocery store and emptied the grocer's stock of coconuts. These fans rubbed smooth an area on the coconut and had me sign it with one of those silver paint pens. I couldn't believe it. I remember a few years back when I was buying some tools and supplies at the Builder's Emporium, a huge hardware outlet store in Los Angeles. I took my items up to the counter, and this 25-year-old checker just looked at me with a straight face and said, "Are you going to fix the radio?" My dear wife Connie reminded me of the time when she and I were living in Malibu, California. We were driving up the Pacific Coast Highway heading home, and we were hungry, so we decided to stop and get some Chinese takeout. There was an Oriental guy behind the counter and another customer waiting around. And this Chinese guy looks up at me and he says, "Ah, you the professor from Gilligan's Island?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Boy, you old." There are a lot of weird fan stories, but one of the stranger incidents happened to Alan Hale. Alan and his wife Trinket were eating in a small seafood restaurant one night. Alan was sporting his skipper's hat when he walked in, and he was instantly recognized. As usual, Alan was happy to sign autographs, but he preferred doing it after his meal. So he requested his starstruck waitress kindly to head off anyone approaching until they had finished eating. After a stream of eager fans had met the skipper, the waitress handed Alan his check and shyly asked for just one more autograph, this time for herself. She said, "Captain Kangaroo, you were one of my favorites." Alan was polite and autographed the restaurant check, and then she left clutching her paper that Alan had signed. "All the best, Captain Kangaroo." Natalie Schaefer used to love to use the Howell name to her advantage. My telephone lines were down from a storm, so I called the telephone company and got nowhere, she said. Then I told them I played Mrs. Howell on Gilligan's Island, and they sent a man right over. Dawn has always loved her fans, and I think she was the cast member who received the most fan mail when we were doing the show. She once boarded a commercial airliner, and the whole plane burst into the Gilligan's theme song. Dawn told me about a trip she took to Germany in which two fans at one of King Ludwig's castles in Bavaria came running up to her saying, "Marianne, Marianne!" Outside of our reunion television specials and a few sitcoms like Alf, on which we once again became castaways for the camera, some of us have participated in promotions and tie-ins for the show. Usually, any live appearances we have made have taken place with a tropical motif, luau's and boat races and such, where fans can meet us and take snapshots. One of the more ingenious Gilligan's promotions was a cast get-together orchestrated as a real 3-hour tour on a luxury excursion boat that held about 400 people. The tour, originating from the shore of Lake Michigan in Chicago, had gone on an hour's joyride before we boarded. We castaways waited on a pier at a pre-arranged location, and at the appropriate moment, we shot off a flare gun, and the excursion boat loaded with fans arrived to rescue us. Coast Guard sirens were blasting as we boarded, fans were screaming, applauding, and singing the theme song when Alan, Bob, Dawn, and I were ushered onto this cruiser full of baby boomers. People kept saying to me that they couldn't believe that they were on a tour boat with us. It was a madhouse, but we loved every second of it. We did several of these promotions in Baltimore, Chicago, New York, and Milwaukee. It was on Baltimore's Chesapeake Bay rescue cruise that two fans at separate moments edged their way through the crowd determined to talk to me. I was floored when they both informed me that they had graduated from Johns Hopkins University and had gone into their respective professions because of me. One of the fans was a woman in her 30s who had received her degree in physics. Later on that night, a guy approached me and introduced himself. He explained that when he was a child, the professor had inspired him, and he had also graduated from Johns Hopkins with a degree in chemistry. I couldn't have been more gratified. Island Fever. Skipper to the professor. Well, if there's anything I can't stand, it's logic. Sometimes I've wondered if people take Gilligan's Island too seriously. It amazes me how even today people assume it's hip to pose this question by asking, why would the Howells bring all of that money along on a 3-hour tour? Man, it doesn't take any gray matter to figure that out. You don't know how many stand-up comics owe money to Gilligan's for writing their material for them. Our show has been fodder for their routines for years. They pose all kinds of riddles. How come the professor could build a nuclear reactor, but he couldn't build a boat to get them off the island? and I never built a nuclear reactor. Of course our show was inconsistent and incongruous. Of course there are unanswered questions. At first we asked the same questions, and then we just accepted it all and stopped wondering. My answer, it's in the script. In fact, it's in the theme song. Do you realize the lyrics lie to you? Think about it. The mate was a mighty sailing man. Come on now. If not for the courage of the fearless crew, the Minnow would be lost. Would be lost. We were lost. And it wasn't a desert isle. It was a jungle island. So your imagination gets a workout, or your gullibility, depending upon how you look at it. Sure, Mr. Howell brought along his stock certificates for the Tehachapuku Oil and Mining Company. Sure, Mr. Howell packed an Indian chief's headdress in his trunks of clothing. Once you get past the insanity of it all, it's not so bad. One question that is often posed to me involves the professor's total lack of sexual interest. Was he asexual? He didn't even know how to kiss a woman affectionately. The answer is that Sherwood Schwartz didn't want to get into the sexual natures of the characters too deeply, outside of the obvious like the Howells' devotion to each other and Ginger's lusty one-liners. Keep in mind that we were targeting this show toward children. The fact that adults came along was a surprise to all of us. Growing up with the professor. My kids grew up always having people stare at our table in restaurants. In school, it was sometimes assumed that if you're the professor's kid, then you must have an unbelievable IQ. Does that sound crazy? You'd be surprised what people think. And when my kids began dating, the notion of bringing someone home to meet their parents might have been a bit uncomfortable, especially when the professor is standing there with folded arms. All in all, maybe it wasn't so bad for David, Kim, and my stepson Courtney. Sure, I made my mistakes as a parent, but I'm proud that I've raised children who have taken responsibility for themselves. In today's world, that's an accomplishment. I thought it might be fun to tell you about how my children felt about visiting the set of Gilligan's Island and growing up with the professor as their father. My son David said, I was on the set of Gilligan's Island maybe 6 or 7 times in the course of the 3 years. The time I remember most was on my 9th birthday, I think. My whole class, maybe 25 or 30 kids, all went to the set for the afternoon to watch the filming. We got a tour of the place and went out to the lagoon, and later on we had a little party. And David says, what I remember most about being in the studio was how they tried to keep us all as quiet as possible during the filming. And later, the whole class was introduced to the cast, and the actors were all nice, especially Dawn Wells. She was always good with kids, I think. And on that day anyway, I think I was the hero of the class. My daughter Kimberly says, I always had the illusion that my dad was the smartest man in the world. Not only because he was my dad, but when you're a kid, your dad can beat up anybody, but also because he was the professor. And I remember thinking that he should be president, he was so smart. David and I both had little TVs in our room, and whenever I got punished, Mom or Dad would take the TV privileges away for a week or so, and the only thing I was allowed to watch was Gilligan's Island. And I'd beg my dad to watch it and say, please, please, please. He naturally gave in. I was on the set when Dad was filming the episode with Zsa Zsa Gabor, and I thought she was trying to marry Dad. I was pretty young, and I remember hating her because I thought she was going to take him away from my mom. And I remember Bob Denver lifting me up and putting me in his director's chair. It was one of those tall director's chairs. He put his white cap on my head and let me wear it for a while. He was very nice, and so was Dawn Wells. She was so sweet to me. And of course, I'm convinced Alan Hale was the kindest man that ever lived. And my stepson, Courtney, says, Russell and my mom were friends for many years, so I can't remember not knowing him. I remember Russell's pal was Guy Williams from Lost in Space, and it was always exciting seeing both of them. What's funny to me is how fans of any age become children again when they meet Russell, and they tend to say the same thing. You remember when you made that invention out of the radio and Gilligan drank the radioactive liquid you made? And Russell says, I sure do. Then later he'd admit, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. Russell could be easily embarrassed by fans sometimes. I remember one time Russell was going down to a 7-Eleven and I asked him if he'd cash some quarters in for me. It was like $20 worth of quarters. When he got there, he pulled all the quarters out of his pocket and they sprayed all over the floor. They rolled everywhere. So there he was on the floor, groping for quarters from under the Twiggy stand, and some lady comes up to him and says, Hey, didn't you used to play the professor on Gilligan's Island? My kids all live in the Los Angeles area now, and they have their own joys and struggles that go along with life and society in general. Courtney works in the construction field and is busy raising his bright little son Max, who is the apple of my eye. Kim is an actress who entered the profession on her own volition, believe me. I warned her of the perils of such a career because an actor's life can be brutal and employment can be sparse, but this is what she wanted to do, and this is what she does. She's very good at it, and I can only wish her luck because she has talent. My son David was a computer programmer before he became the first AIDS coordinator for the city of Los Angeles for a few years. His primary responsibility was the administration of several $1 million for housing, the construction of hospices, as well as the development of educational programs about AIDS. While David worked as the AIDS coordinator, his most important contribution, I feel, was the creation of the AIDS policy for the city. He fought long and hard to get that through the governmental red tape, not to mention the depressing lack of public concern, which is just now beginning to change. And David has to take it easy these days, and he has left his job because of personal health reasons. You see, my son has the very disease that he fought so diligently against during the course of his career as the AIDS coordinator. As they say, AIDS is not restricted demographically. Sooner or later, everyone will come in contact with an individual who has AIDS. I would simply like you to know about the strength and bravery and the courage of my son. He's an extraordinary fella. He doesn't deserve this illness. But then there isn't a person on this earth who deserves AIDS. You know, I have been very fortunate. I have been a person who has been able to make a living doing what I wanted to do all of my adult life. I have been a professional actor for over 40 years. When I was a young actor, under contract to Universal Studios back in the early 50s, I worked in films with wonderful character actors who had come out from New York, who had been in the theater and had been in films for 20 and 25 years. I used to say to them, oh, someday I hope I can say that I've been an actor for that long. And it's come to pass. I'm very fortunate and I'm very grateful to God and to the universe for this to have happened to me and to have had the wonderful life and the children I have. And I want to thank all the fans of Gilligan's Island all over the world. I want to thank the people who have personally been kind to me and have followed my career and have been wonderful to me. And I thank you for watching, and I thank you for listening.